Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father, work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father, work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father, work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Oh, work it out. You work it out for Mother Lisa. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father, work it out. Oh, let God work it out.
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos. And today we got an open panel discussion, the topic being the Trump administration, grading the performance thus far. We're moving into 3 months since Trump and his administration has taken over the U.S. government. And there is some good, there's some bad, and there's some ugly. So we're going to be discussing a little bit about that. The link to join is already in the video description. I'm going to share it right here in the live chat if anybody wants to join. I am joined right now by my friend, if you want to, scholar, historian, incredibly erudite individual. Jose, how you doing today, brother?
Doing all right. Doing
So,
better than the past year, actually. So
Do what?
doing the best I've done in a year. So
Yeah, I know. I mentioned that seeing you when you hopped on. You look great, man. You look a lot better, a lot healthier. Glad to hear that you're feeling better, and just in time during Lent, the Lenten season. So
exactly, this
able
will be
to,
this will be the second Lent where I'm actually gaining weight because I'm recovering from disease. So
glory to God. And your parish has got some interesting new developments. I saw Father Moses, the property you guys purchased is gorgeous.
Yep. So we're going to be having what do you call it? So we got land that we're going to be able to use as what do you call it? A place to build a future cathedral. Right now, turn the existing building into a parish, and we'll finally have our own cemetery, which will be fantastic. And what you call it? And we're still going to have the old building, and we'll be essentially functioning, two parishes. So and there's also a mission that we have on in the South Austin. So that's 3 parishes total surrounding Austin. So that's where we're at.
Oh, somebody's saying they can still hear the intro music.
Yeah, I believe it's a little bit in the background for some reason.
Okay. You guys, everything, mic check. They're saying my mic's low. That's what Jose said earlier, but we thought we figured it out. How does it sound now? Check, 1 2 1 2. Looks like everybody's saying.
So they're hearing it. Okay.
Well, they're saying my audio's low. It's like the soft intro music is a bit low. Let me check my settings here.
I'm going to try to hear you on the stream to see.
What about now? Check. How's it sound, chat?
Okay, it sounds good to me.
They say that's better. I never changed any of the settings. I hate that. I've kind of done a hiatus, so we haven't streamed in a while. We did 2 streams. Okay, sounds good. Excellent. All right, we're back to normal now. So as you guys know, haven't been very active for basically almost 2 months, basically for sure a month and a half. And for anybody who didn't know, I basically checked out of content creation and anything online to finish the dissertation. I was just speaking with Jose backstage about everything. So really excited to have finally finished the dissertation. It's 369 pages. And I just got the go-ahead today from my advisor to send it to my doctoral committee. So I'll be sending it out to a handful of professors with the expectation to defend this in May, and then I will be officially done. So kind of been a hiatus, haven't done much content, but I am so excited to finally have achieved that milestone. And God willing, everything will go good. My advisor assured me that everything would, but you never know. So really, really excited for essentially the next stage of my life. I got legally married last year. We're going to get religiously married this year and finish my PhD and try to just focus on building this business and growing and advancing into the next stage of life. So I'm excited. I feel a huge weight lifted off my shoulders, and now I can just stream. I'm going to stream like 4 or 5 times a week now because I have nothing else that I have hold me back. So anyways, enough about all that stuff. Just keeping you guys updated for why it's been so sparse in the streams as of recent. But today we're getting into the Trump administration, and there's so many things that we can dive into. Obviously, the talk of the town right now is the tariffs that Trump just implemented. And I suppose that today, again, this is an open panel. Anybody is free to join today. I will share that link again. And hopefully we get some people of mixed opinions. If you're a MAGA supporter out there and you kind of see that, if your grade for Donald Trump, the administration thus far is an A+, please join. We want to hear your opinions. And before I ask Jose kind of what his opening thoughts are, like I was saying, the tariffs are kind of the talk of the town. Last week, it was the U.S. essentially starting another war with Yemen in an attempt to what appears to be put terror in the hearts of the Iranians. And it feels like, and this has kind of been the sentiments for the last month, I would suspect, is that Israel essentially controls our geopolitical endeavors and such. The talks between Putin and Trump seem to kind of be dissipating. Not sure what exactly is going on there. I'd be curious what Jose's thoughts are. But Jose, where would you begin? There was so much excitement when Trump first took office and the rapid pace of change for the first month. What are your thoughts on everything now? And if you just had to give a general assessment moving into 3 months, what are your thoughts?
So the first thing I'd say is I'd rating him against other U.S. presidents. He's still doing better than pretty much anyone since Andrew Jackson. But the thing is, how high of a bar is that? So I'd say like one thing that's been impressive is the fact that he's taken on the bureaucracy directly, although he still has a ways to go. One thing to keep in mind is it took Vladimir Putin about 14 years. Well, yeah, about up to 14 years before he really got control of the Russian government. In the case of Xi Jinping, it also took several years as well. And he's still in his, he's what do you call it? Xi Jinping is still not the autocrat that people think he is in the West. There's still plenty of factions and elements that he has to work around or work with, in order to rule China. So one thing in terms of a start, he definitely got into their OODA loop. He definitely broke into their cycle or the cycle of his opponents. So on that side, it is good. What I see that he's trying to do. So the U.S. historically is the U.S. government itself, the federal government, was set up as a semi-Bonapartist technocracy, which is essentially another way of saying bureaucratic rule without an emperor to keep the bureaucracy in check. And what Putin is trying to do is to turn it into a unitary presidency, essentially what de Gaulle established in France as the Fifth Republic, or for what Putin is now in Russia, which is essentially having all power concentrated in the actual executive who actually has authority over the bureaucracy. So the question is whether or not he's going to win it in the long run. But the fact that if had so many courts throw out really crazy out there rulings trying to stop his direct control of the bureaucracy indicates that the bureaucracy actually is in danger of losing power. First time that's ever happened in the history of the United States. Historically, from president to president, the technocrats just get stronger. Now, whether or not that's a good thing, I mean, it comes down to who's president. And as mentioned before, there is a very incestuous relationship that's going on with Israel that may result in the U.S. being dragged into a war with Iran, which is a war that the U.S. will lose. Even from the U.S. military wargaming themselves, they estimated it would take at least 2 million boots on the ground just to establish a foothold in the Iranian mountains. Not to conquer Iran, but just to get a foothold within the country.
Right.
It is far larger, far more hostile terrain than Iraq. It's
the goal of war, if I may interject, the goal of war is not to win. The goal of war is so the Jews can make money.
Yeah, the only problem with that is that's historically true. The problem with the war of Iran at this point is the United States is risking a Syracuse expedition where they overstretch themselves and the whole thing collapses. And then suddenly the banking system collapses on top. So that's the fundamental question. I know you have guys like Tom Luongo and others who talk about how they believe that there's a war going on among the banking class over whether or not to continue with the series of wars that the U.S. has been waging since the end of the Cold War. Now I'm not sure.
Well, I know for one, I would support nobody. I know that if they tried to force me to join the military, then I would fucking kill anybody who tries to make me do something I don't want to fucking do.
Hey, just easy on the language.
Sorry about that. I'm just saying.
And easy on. We all get the interesting country in the Middle East, but if you could just feel free to say whatever your opinion is.
The reason I interjected was because he said that we would try to conquer Iraq. He doesn't understand that the soldiers are just nothing more than pawns, and the only thing they do, it's a deal. It's like the Jewish in the back room, they're just making deals about who's going to get a little bit more money here, they don't care who dies on the surface. It's completely ridiculous. And no government ever is legitimate because it's just a slavery. The word government itself is slavery. That's what it means. So to say that they're actually trying to fight a war, wars only exist so they can make money. That's it. They're not trying to win. It's not about anything else. It's about killing as many people as possible and money.
All right, I'll offer a little bit of pushback in that. So there is a certain class that does care about money. So you take the Afghan war, you got the Sackler family who made boatloads off of Oxycontin.
The opioids,
the opioids. And then in the case of Syria, you have people who made boatloads of money off of the seizure of the Iranian oil fields in the northeast of Syria. But the thing is, the people at the top, money to them is just a tool because these people literally print money out of nothing. So for them, the goal, there really is a goal of essentially unitary one pole, essentially one world government. Like that is the explicit goal of organizations like the CFR, for example.
Okay, let me interject there and correct you. That's not the goal. That's the way it's been. That's the way it's been for tens of thousands of years. There is only one world government. It's owned by the 13 royal families of the Jews in a global communist hierarchy. And then there's the 13 divine bloodlines that they serve.
Okay, this is coming from someone who's actually descended from Spanish kings.
Yeah, we all know all this stuff, Nemesis. So just trying to, and we obviously we're on a foreign platform here that limits what can be explicitly stated. So, but all those rabbit holes, I think most of us have already gone down and probably agree.
No, they're not rabbit holes. They're just facts.
Yeah. Okay. But a rabbit hole is can also be filled with facts. It's just something that is a hole from the mainstream narrative.
If the royal families all were inclusion like that, then what do you call it? Tsar Nicholas II would not have been murdered. That's all I got to say on that. That's
what I'm trying to say is that the government has no goals, because the only goal of the government is to do whatever the Pope says, Mecca and Jerusalem. That's the three that run the world.
There's a contradiction
the three
there.
religions. So it doesn't matter what Mecca, Jerusalem, and Washington.
I think the world is a little bit more complicated than that, dude.
Indeed.
Yeah, it is.
What are you talking about? The Vatican has $18 trillion of the $90,000.
No, they don't. They're actually going bankrupt.
What are you talking about? They're not going bankrupt. What the?
No, they're literally going
they have
bankrupt.
$18 trillion. You can't go bankrupt once you have $18 trillion. What are you talking about?
Oh, yes, you can. Because to maintain it,
Yeah, you
maintain
can.
infrastructure like that.
They're
that
going
requires
okay.
immense
So
cash flow.
Vatican's going bankrupt, huh? Okay.
I don't think any of us are
What kind of psyop
necessarily
is this? Like,
rejecting
who you
the
guys working
idea
for? You
that
guys
the Vatican
working
has a
for
lot of power.
Apostolic or Church of Rome?
In the words of
I know
Joseph
you're working for
Stalin,
the Dark Occult.
in the words of Joseph Stalin, how many troops does the Pope have?
Yeah, I know you're trying to derail me because I'm talking about the Church of the Black Sun and what's real. And that you're an agent. You're an agent of the Dark Occult.
Oh, we're all agents of the Dark Occult.
No, anybody who's trying to derail me is.
What group are you a part of? What are you?
I don't know
what
the hell you guys think you're doing. Disagree
what are you?
with me, but you don't disagree with an occult.
What are you?
That knows the truth.
What are you, dude? What are you?
What do you mean? What am I?
You just accused us of being agents of the darkness or whatever. What are you?
No, it's
what are you an agent
odd.
of?
The reason I said that is because it's odd that you guys don't know this. It's odd.
We all know this.
We all know this. We all know this.
I remember when I was 14
God,
and got into conspiracy theories too.
I don't know why you guys are such niggers about this.
Dude, this guy's a troll. Boot him out of here.
I'm
He's a troll.
He is a troll.
That guy's a troll. Get him out of here.
Oh gosh, that's the only problem with some of these open. Usually, it's so insightful. We get so many good Orthodox perspectives, but you never know who's watching.
That was good.
Oh man.
So, anyways, Elijah, Ivan, Charles, welcome, gentlemen. Elijah, what's your thoughts on so far with the Trump administration? Back to the open panel discussion.
Actually, can you have Ivan go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Ivan.
Okay, sure. I completely agree with Jose in terms of like Trump, let's say, trying to take a jab at the establishment, like at the deep state for the first time. And I don't know if he's going to have enough time to like right the ship this time around, unless he gets like, I don't know. I don't see it in him to like grab power to himself. I don't see him like taking power to himself. It would be fun to watch, honestly. Like, it would be based from my perspective. I do have my criticisms in terms of I don't think that he's going about the tariffs in the right way, but perhaps I'm not as informed as I should be to be speaking on the topic. But like in general, I do agree with having tariffs, but I'm not sure that he's doing them in the proper way, right?
Okay, so let's focus on the tariffs then, because there's so much.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm getting an echo from somebody.
Could it be me? Give me a second.
Is your microphone next to a speaker or something?
Yep. Did it fix that?
Check. Yeah, I don't hear an echo anymore.
Perfect. So
Yeah, so go ahead and lay out, because I got my own thoughts on the tariffs, and I'd be curious what Jose and the rest of the panel thinks. But yeah, let's start on the tariffs. We can get into Yemen and the Middle Eastern conflict. We can get into some of the domestic investments that we've been seeing and the Stargate project. All that stuff's fair game. But yeah, why don't we start with the tariffs? So what's your thoughts, Ivan?
my thoughts. Well, I've been hearing from a lot of the libertarian sphere that the criteria for Trump's tariffs was, let's say, to rectify trade imbalances. So
Right.
and like from what I understand of economics, like you don't aim to, let's say, to like increase your tariffs in terms of your trade imbalance. You want to obviously like revert the trade imbalances for them to be in your favor, but that's not how you actually measure what amount of tariffs you ought to lay on other countries, right? So I think if that is true, that I've heard from like intellectuals who are more on the libertarian side, then that's kind of a faux pas. Like that's a step in the wrong direction, because that's not actually how you set the tariffs. But other than that, I mean, I think he's going generally in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, let me say my quick thoughts, and I'd be curious what Jose's thoughts are. So the way that I've been looking at it is, it looks like Trump kind of has the position of the late 19th century America, where a lot of the federal income comes through tariffs. And in regards to protecting the domestic workforce and manufacturing, I think it's a good thing. I think it is going to hurt. So everybody's talking about a fear that prices may rise, and they might. But in the long term, in regards to at least the next few years of building all these factories and getting all this manufacturing back to the United States, it's ultimately going to help the domestic worker and domestic prosperity. So in that sense, I think it's good. Where I'm confused is like the recent rhetoric the last week is where Trump's talking about putting like secondary tariffs or sanctions on Russia. And this rhetoric out of the Trump administration that keeps acting like Russia's in like this economic free fall, which isn't the case at all. And so my thoughts are, is one, I'm worried that it's kind of business as usual, in the sense that the U.S. is going to try to dictate global power through tariffs and sanctions and stuff like that. But at the same time, as somebody in America, I think it's actually beneficial long term for the domestic worker, manufacturing, and that type of stuff. So I think ultimately I'm in favor of the tariffs. I think that it's good. We've already seen like Canada capitulate as soon as they got put in place. They now want to eliminate all U.S. tariffs if we do the same, which in a way gets back to the whole free exchange NAFTA ideal of like the 1990s. But what are your thoughts, Jose, about the tariffs and how they're being implemented?
So first, I'd say the book I was going to recommend to people. So this is the National System of Political Economy by Friedrich List. So this is actually, like, I've read this, and this is going to be the text that I'm going to use for my kids when they're in high school age for homeschooling.
Man, how boring was that book?
That's the thing. I mean, so if you're someone who like is sick and tired of the whole capitalism versus communism thing, you'll find it interesting. But yeah, it is on the drier side. There is some interesting perspectives in it in terms of if you're more philosophically inclined. He has some interesting criticisms of Adam Smith, in that Smith was assumes materialism and nominalism and reductionism and a couple other isms that List is not a fan of. But he what do you call it? So the thing with if in the case of like List framework, which was what he was describing is referred to as the American School of Economics. So the United States in the 19th century, it was not capitalist nor was it communist. People think of that those are the only two economic systems that exist, but there are actually many others. You have medieval guild system that you see throughout the medieval era. You have the concept of distributism, which is trying to describe that medievalism. You have in this case you have what's called the American School, which is not just unique to America. Other nations that used it even before America would be Russia, would be one, Tsarist Russia. Others who industrialized using what's called the American School include, interestingly enough, the United Kingdom, China, Japan, Germany as well. but yeah, so in the gist, in terms of what Trump is trying to do, so the goal is to reindustrialize the United States, or in the words of Friedrich List, you want to maximize power. Fundamentally, it's not about the most important thing is not wealth. It's not the stuff that you have. It's not the money you accumulate. What is more important, as he put this question, that you give your sons a bunch of money when you die, or you gave them a bunch of skills so that they're able to make the wealth at a whim. Storms come, floods come that destroy everything. What's more important, that your kids had a whole lot of wealth, which just got wiped away in the flood and no ability to remake it, or the actual productive power to just rebuild from scratch if they had to, and scale that up to a national size. And so from List's perspective, industrial policy should be geared, monetary policy, financial policy should be geared towards maximizing the actual productive power of a nation. So a high protective tariff is part of that. Though he points out that you don't want the tariffs to be too high, in his own thing, but there is a sweet spot where you want to be at, in order to essentially, because what you want to do is one of the criticisms of, for example, David Ricardo, who wrote the comparative advantage. I got a little girl who's crying.
Yeah. So go ahead, Miguel.
Actually, I'll be right back. She's crying. 1 second.
All right.
Okay. Now, continuing on, building off on what he was saying, I completely get the angle he was going for. Yes, the issue that I see is I don't see Trump like actually embodying those, let's say, concepts, in the sense that
which ones in specific? Because I think the industrialization is certainly the case. Look at all the investment that the U.S. has gotten since he's taken over.
Yeah, definitely. That's part of the idea. Like, that's the goal. That's what he wants. But you actually have to measure the tariffs that you're gonna put on other people, because basically what you're doing with tariffs is like you're offsetting your own taxation, right? Because in order for you to stay competitive, right, you put on tariffs because, let's say, I don't know, you're competing against China. China might be more efficient than you, or it might even be, let's say, strategically trying to subsidize an industry in order to destroy your own. So the tariffs are a means for you to protect your own industry from being, I don't know, destroyed by, a subsidized industry abroad, or even like legit better competitors than that you have, right? But the problem is,
or cheaper labor, right? So part of the motive to get the automotive industry back in the United States is because it is cheaper to manufacture things abroad, and so you place tariffs to make it cheaper to actually do it domestically.
Exactly. Well, not cheaper, but cheaper relatively to the
more competitive within the global market, because we don't pay people 20 cents.
Well, here, let me hop in here real quick, because one of the things that I'm kind of worried about is, let's just say, if we implement all these tariffs and we try to basically compete against China in a lot of ways, one of the things that I'm worried about is if we're ramping up our production and not just certain goods that we manufacture, but also our produce, because I think a lot of people forget that America exports a lot of produce compared to something like meat, for example. But don't people sometimes forget that China actually owns a lot of farmland in the United States? If we're trying to compete with China with those types of imports and exports and all that stuff, wouldn't that somehow be a roundabout way of actually helping out China if they actually own some farmland, and if they are exporting to themselves with their farmland that they own in our country? Wouldn't that actually be benefiting them? Well, wouldn't we have to just take away the farmland that China owns? Be like, you can't own the land here anymore. Like, you can't do that.
Did you see the state of Missouri already did that? That was like in the last month that they revoked.
Really?
Yeah, they already filed like a lawsuit. And so the plan is, and it's expected to pass, is that they're going to be able to take back the land that the lawsuit connects it back to like a government owning it in one way. And so they're going to take it all, everything that's been purchased inside Missouri, they're going to take back and be able to, either the state owns it or sell it back to the private sector.
I just can't believe that people are even, or not people. I just can't believe that our country is even allowed to do that anyways. Like, how do we ever get into that position where we're selling land in our country to other countries? How is that even possible? That is nuts to me.
It's from the balance of payments. So when the balance of payments is essentially the flow of dollars. When you have when the balance of payments is negative, which it has been since the end of World War II, that means people outside have more and more purchasing power with dollars than people inside the United States. And the things you can do with that is they can either buy stuff from the United States, but what has happened instead is they've been buying assets. So that's why you have so much foreign-owned stuff inside the United States. China, of course, has had a massive balance of payments advantage with the United States because of America's lack of an industrial policy for the last 50 plus years. And so that's enabled them to, buy the land to begin with. And of course, what makes it worse is most of the land that China has bought, they didn't buy it for productive purposes. They bought land that was nearby American army bases.
Yeah.
So that's
So you think it's more of an espionage operation, right?
Yeah. Right. But to your point, Elijah, I read an article that said China actually purchases like 1/4 or more of the meat production in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm all for like potentially a policy in which all meat production and all produce that you're talking about first is made for Americans, and whatever's left over can be used as international exports or something like that.
Yeah, the thing I was going to say
so this is actually one of the things that I had a conversation about this a topic that's very similar to this. I might be kind of going off a little bit, but not really. It does connect back to this, but like, I'm about as conservative as it could possibly get. Okay. Like, I think some people might consider me as like pretty, like, far right or in a lot of ways, but I also understand that the world is really complicated in some other ways too. And so I do have a couple views here and there that I guess are like, I'm not entirely sure if you would call it left leaning or not, but so for example, when you were talking about how, you think that meat production and like all that stuff should be for Americans first, and then leftovers should go overseas or whatever. I think the same exact way for not just meat production and produce and just whatever, but just everything in general. I think one of the things that I get really tired of neocons about is when neocons constantly think that we need to not send money overseas and like fund Ukraine, or sorry, not Ukraine, but like all these other countries with the exception of Ukraine and Israel, according to the neocons, right? But they're like, we shouldn't be sending all this money overseas. Biden should stop doing that. But then when you go, okay, so should we take this money that goes overseas and should we spend it on our people? And then all of a sudden they start getting mad again because then they accuse us of being socialist. They're like, oh, you're doing communism, you're doing socialism. Oh, so it's like no matter what you do with your money or your produce or your product or whatever, you're always upsetting them in some regard. It's either you're going overseas and you're wasting it, or you're committing communism and socialism here. And that's one of the things that I guess, so this goes back to the kind of maybe left-wing type of things that I believe is that I don't believe that having social programs in particular are necessarily communist or socialist, because I think that if we have these policies of our product should be for our people first and then sending it out, like, shouldn't this also apply to taxes as well? Like, shouldn't we try to funnel some tax money into people who might not be able to afford meat or something? Like, shouldn't we take care of our own in that type of sense? Because
I agree.
If you look at USAID, you see, and what Doge has been kind of exposing with that, you'll see a lot of times that some of that money was going to, I'm not going to talk about the whole LGBT crap, but just in general, like, some of that money would go overseas to people in need, in big scare quotes, right? Which obviously that's probably not even true, but let's just say hypothetically they weren't lying, right? Let's say it actually was going to people in need, but foreign people. Why shouldn't we do that for people in our country? Because we should take care of our own. We should be people of citizens of the people here. Maybe people who are homeless or people who are poor. Like, we should have, in my opinion, systems that should subsidize or help people who are Americans. Well,
I
meat
agree.
production, produce, all that stuff.
And so I'll pose a follow-up question to the panel. I agree about all that stuff. That's what it would mean to be America first. And social programs for the disfortunate, I don't think should be something that should label somebody as a communist. That's far-fetched. And that's part of the problem in America, generally speaking. And I've been noticing this too with the MAGA movement in general, is the excitement that's going on right now is people are so reluctant to voice any criticism, which is really interesting. But, first we have to have like energy independence. So the oil, the initiative to mine rare earth minerals here in the United States, I think all that's absolutely good in regards to what you're mentioning. And also the removal of income tax, at least for people under $150,000. According to, I forget the gentleman's name, is it Lutnick or somebody who's working with the Trump administration? He said after these tariffs go in place, the next thing that they plan on doing is removing income tax for all Americans under $150,000. That'd be huge for working class people. It doesn't directly address, you're talking about the disenfranchised, like people that maybe don't even work. And that's really a whole nother conversation in regards to how we deal with, people that aren't contributing and how we support them in our societies. I think that's another conversation. But do you think that Trump is a neocon? I think is an interesting point. That was the question I was going to pose to the panel, because obviously we just saw him endorse Lindsey Graham, which he bashes Lindsey Graham. He bashes Zelensky, and now he's defending Zelensky against Putin, and he's promoting Lindsey Graham to get reelected. But these tariffs, to the point of the conversation, isn't very neocon, right? The neocon move would make sure like the asset is cheaper. So therefore, exporting labor to other countries, that's kind of the move.
I don't think it would be very useful with labeling Trump as neocon.
Right.
I think it'd be more useful to just say he does some neocon things and some not neocon things.
Yeah.
Right. Like, for example, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, even to be more clear, I would say we could say that he's certainly a Zionist, and that kind of covered in regards to the Venn diagram, the overlap with the neocon. But I think economically he's actually not neocon at all. He's more of like the late 1800s into the 19th century kind of vision of America. But Jose was wanting to say, and I want Charles to jump in too. So Charles, jump in after Jose regarding all this.
Yeah, well, just to finish what I was saying before is that Trump's tariffs are essentially just one of the components that are needed for reindustrialization. So the other two in the American school are essentially the what they called back then the public improvement program, which is essentially infrastructure. The one of the government functions, or one of its domains, should be providing infrastructure that reduces the cost of transportation, and internal transportation in particular, to be as cheap as possible as a subsidy for industry and for more sections of the country to be able to interact and trade with one another, and thus encourage industry to, instead of being concentrated all in one location, to spread out. The reason being is because, and he actually has hard data on that, when you have for example, you take a given county, when you have a mixture of industry and agriculture, that results in the maximization of land values, of productive power, both for the agriculture and for industry. So he was a huge advocate. Thank you. He was a huge advocate of developing industry throughout, having it spread out throughout the nation. This also has a benefit of like during war. Ironically, 100 years later, this would prove to be a wise investment in that you look at the bombing campaigns in World War II. When you have all your industry concentrated in one area, it's an easily bombable target. Even today, you look at industry in Russia, like even if the U.S. had air superiority, their ability to bomb everything to the Stone Age is much reduced, because things are very spread out, intentionally so, especially when it comes to military production. So decentralized industry is actually, it's useful not just for maximizing productive power and the wealth of the people that list argues for, but it actually has a defensive military application. And the third and final element is the essentially nationalization of banking, running banking usury free as a utility. So the czars actually did do that. And that was one of the things that Tsar Nicholas II in particular was expanding upon and resulted in Russia just exploding in industrialization. So the amount of damage that that the Bolsheviks did, when people talk about the industrialization that Stalin achieved, what Stalin achieved was essentially just getting Russia back to the level that it was under Tsar Nicholas II. So those are the three pillars of I'd say of the American school. So essentially, a high protective tariff with the intention of maximizing industrial capacity or industrial power. What do you call it? Government-based infrastructure, which reduces the costs of transportation to be as low as possible. And then three, essentially, what do you call it? A usury-free financial system. Like that would be the ideal of the American school. And, America didn't even hit that ideal in the 19th century. Russia ironically did then, and they'll probably hit it again in the 21st we're in the 21st. Yeah, 21st. And China is actually trying to go in that direction, because I know right now Xi Jinping is trying to crack down on the shadow banking sector. So it's a race between China and Russia over who's going to be the most, like, it's interesting. In the words of Michael Hudson was actually asked this year, and just so people who don't know him, so Michael Hudson is a heterodox Marxist. So in other words, he's considered a heretic by other Marxists. But he's unusual in that he's the one and only Marxist economist I know who actually makes predictions that happen, because he's a Marxist heretic, not an orthodox Marxist. But he was asked the question, I think about a month and a half ago, where he was asked, like, what are the nations where there's not what nations have no Marxism whatsoever? And he said, well, there are only two nations where Karl Marx is not even mentioned or present in any way, shape, or form, and those are Russia and China. And I was just laughing super hard when he explicitly said that. And there was another communist on the panel who agreed, and they're complaining about how, like, Marx is totally ignored in Russia and China. And it's like, and my attitude is like, well, of course, because they got burned by him so bad. So. But
anybody's been to China. That's the big thing about the misnomer with the CCP. I mean, it is communist in the sense of its centralized structure, but they are very capitalist. That was one of the big things when the first week going to China. Everybody's interested in making money. It's all about money, and it's like it's a very interesting hybridization from like ultra capitalist financial reward incentive structure with centralized government power.
Yep, and the most discussed economic book in the Chinese Politburo is Friedrich List. So this is you'll find this also in the Kremlin too. It's fascinating to me that the Chinese and the Russians have embraced 19th century American economics, while America, for some reason, decided to reject it at the end of World War II, and essentially eliminate all the policies around it. So, of course, in terms of how's Donald Trump faring, well, he's got the tariffs done. The question is he going to definancialize the economy? That is the bigger thing, because that's, as Ivan's pointing out, Ivan's betting no, but that is the next obstacle. He has to definancialize the American economy, and then he has to rebuild American infrastructure. Those are the two other necessary steps for the United States to reindustrialize. If he fails in either one of those, the U.S. will not reindustrialize, and the U.S. is just going to get poor.
Right. Well, I have a follow-up, but I want Charles to jump in. So go ahead, Charles. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so a lot of this economic stuff, well, first and foremost, thanks for having me on. But
of course,
a lot of this economic stuff is going over my head. I'm not going to lie. But something that Father Peter here says that I feel like is very true, and it applies not just to physical or physical peace, but also like financial peace is you can't have peace without the Prince of Peace, right? So I feel like a lot of this, St. Paul says that we're co-workers with Christ. So it is important that we speak these things out. But I also feel like our financial security is going to be proportional to our spiritual awakening in our country, Right. This stuff does have to be worked out. But something that I really wanted to talk about was how do you define a neocon when you're talking about is Trump a neocon or not?
Well, I mean, neoconservatism is a legitimate political ideology that comes out of Trotskyism.
Okay, that's over my head. I apologize.
Okay. Yeah. It's like a legitimate. It's not just a nomenclature we use to define Republicans that aren't fully conservative. It's a real legitimate political ideology.
So I always hear it as a pejorative almost,
it's used as a pejorative now, but that's because these people have run everything into the ground through this ideology.
Is being a Zionist part of being a neocon? Would that be a prerequisite?
Being a what?
Zionist.
Being a Zionist.
I would say no. I mean, in the terms of neoconservatism, not necessarily. In regards to the influence AIPAC and the Israel lobby has in America, that's just true for both the right and left. I think that's just the tragic fate of American politics right now. And that's going to come up to another point I want to bring up with free speech. But I wanted to follow up with Jose when he was talking about like the domestic economy and kind of freeing it from the grasp of usury. I don't see that happening, but I do see, and I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are. If you've been following the gold trade, is that the U.S. has been like the biggest purchaser of gold in the world since Trump took office. And the rumor is, and the reason why he wanted to have like the crypto reserve is that he's trying to offset the U.S. financial debt for the purpose of making, you know, the U.S. more investable, worth more. And we've never used our gold reserve to offset national debt before. And so he wants to do that for the first time. Is that moving in that direction? Potentially. I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are, but I don't think he's going to, you know, I see him as trying to reform within the system, but he's definitely not going to attack the central bank system.
Yeah, it's the banks themselves who are the Federal Reserve itself that's been buying gold, and the reason is so it's pretty much an open secret. I mean, it's not hard to find, but the what do you call it? The United States, since it went off the gold standard, essentially the gold in Fort Knox has been leased. They've been leasing it to gold dealers who in turn have been, you know, either selling it to investors or selling it to, you know, India, for example, for their jewelry market, etc. So there's like almost no gold left that's actually physically there. So they're trying to essentially unwind.
And you notice that rhetoric about going to Fort Knox has kind of dissipated. I don't know what's going on there, but and this may not even be accurate, but from what I was listening, one of the gold experts, he did an interview with Tucker, and he was claiming that during World War II, we had about like 18 tons of gold, and we sold and we liquidated a lot of that to our allies and stuff after World War II. And he believed that it's down to 5 tons or less that we actually have, the United States actually has.
That can be the case. I know, like in terms of the origin of the reason why the U.S. went off the gold standard was one, because you had a negative balance of payments, which meant that the U.S. had to be exporting all that gold. Charles de Gaulle was the one who actually kicked off the what do you call it? The gold run on the U.S. financial system. So the United States tried to assassinate Charles de Gaulle, which is how America thanks its allies, you know, after winning a war. And he was not too happy about that for some reason. And he decided to punch the Americans where it hurt really as hard as possible. And so what de Gaulle did, he started essentially demanding, or what do you call it? So normally people's gold reserves that were stored in, or dollars that they had, people would just, you know, reinvest it, etc. Whatever dollars he got in excess over in France, he immediately used to repatriate gold from America. And he was essentially draining down America's gold supply, and that is what actually forced the United States off the gold standard. So the unwinding of the American financial system was, interestingly enough, kicked off by Charles de Gaulle, because the United States tried to kill him in thanks for they wanted to turn France into a puppet state of the United States, whereas de Gaulle wanted to free France. I mean, de Gaulle fought Hitler because he wanted to free France. He didn't want France to then be a subject of the Americans and the British, which it ended up becoming. But de Gaulle was the one who actually started the death blow of the American financial system. And so what you've had play out over the last 50 years is the slow unwinding of the American financial system, where essentially America went pure fiat, or more accurately, pure credit money.
Right.
Then on top of that, what's been happening over the last 20 years, 30 years actually, you've had what do you call it? You've had investors and now countries essentially calling COMEX and the City of London and New York and, you know, Fort Knox, the Federal Reserve, on gold, and they've been buying up gold. You've had essentially a run on gold for the last 3 decades. And so far, the City of London and New York have been able to, and the Federal Reserve have been able to manipulate the gold price in order to keep it from going up. You know, you had that point where, you know, went up tenfold in like 2002, 2003, where it went from like $200 an ounce to 2,000. And you see this with gold, where it goes up and then it just flatlines for a while and then it goes up again. It just comes down to how much is their ability or capacity left of being able to manipulate gold prices. And just so people know, historically, the Rothschilds were the dominant manipulators of gold prices going back to the 19th century. it's something that actually came up. Someone asked me about the Long Depression in the 19th century, and I didn't recognize the term. I knew it as Crime of 73. But that's where the U.S. went, essentially demonetized silver. That was done. That was pushed by the Rothschilds because they wanted to get the U.S. They essentially saw the Lincoln greenback as the biggest threat to their monetary system. So they wanted to get the U.S. onto the gold standard because the Rothschilds then controlled gold, and then from there they can manipulate the U.S. into having a Federal Reserve. So that was the long play that they were doing. The thing is, their ability to manipulate gold appears to be coming to its end. The fellow I mentioned, Michael Hudson, is actually an expert. He's the world's leading expert on balance of payment, or the system dynamics of balance of payments, and as well as he knows a lot about So essentially, even from his own perspective, like he's pointed out, like essentially the ability to manipulate gold prices by the West, as he puts it, the West, in reality, the banking families which control, the City of London and the Federal Reserve, their ability to manipulate the gold price is becoming more and more limited, and it's going to break. And it's, in his opinion, it's just starting to break.
Right.
Do you think that eventually we're heading towards a future where the government is going to basically try to manipulate the same exact thing with cryptocurrency as they've done with precious metals?
Yeah. There's no reason they won't do it.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, it actually, one thing that lends credence, I know Jay was complaining about it. Like, why on earth would the Trump administration, of all the Bitcoin, all the crypto coins to get, why are they also buying Ripple? And the reason is because they're looking to demonetize gold completely. And essentially because right now you have 124 pieces of paper that claim the same exact ounce of gold. And that's a huge problem. You can only make do one of those 124 claims. So essentially what the U.S. government is apparently planning is they're going to say, sorry, we don't actually have the gold, but here's some Ripple instead. And essentially just substitute people with cryptocurrency that they don't care for in order to make do on the gold contracts, which the U.S. government, or rather the Federal Reserve, has set up. So that appears to be the way that they're planning to go. And that's their path to demonetize gold and to essentially alleviate the federal government of their contracts that are due in gold.
Brother, you learned all this from that dry-ass book, dude?
No, not just this book, but I do read a lot of things on balance of payments, etc. I do plan on reading Michael Hudson. I've heard him in interviews, and I've read some of the stuff he's written, but I do need to get my hands on his books.
How much chapstick do you use on your lips when you read that book?
Well, maybe none, but it's me. So I'm, what do you call it? I've been blessed in that I was raised without television. So, all I could do when it was raining outside was reading.
That's good.
So I just shared it in the private chat. Oops. I was going to share the video that I was talking about. It's with Luke Roman. And so he's, I guess, a gold expert in New York. And he hits on what Jose's talking about, but he kind of has a different take. And I'm not saying he's accurate or correct, but his take is that Vance, Trump, and some of his financial advisors are aware of what's going on with gold and the manipulation, and they see what's going on with the BRICS and the amount of gold that China and Russia particularly are acquiring right now as a major threat to the U.S. And so the U.S., if we're only dependent on the reserve note, we're going to be screwed when people ask for like their payments. And if we back that by acquiring as much gold and stockpiling as much gold as we can, well, now we have actual value behind all that. So he mentions about the Federal Reserve, but he also mentions that he believes that Trump's long-term plan is to acquire gold as well, so that the U.S. will have that type of that worth to back up the U.S. national debt along with the crypto. So I'm not saying he's accurate. It was just an interesting take that I was listening, but that's the case that he was kind of presenting to Tucker, was that this is not spoken about publicly, but from his contact and from what he understands in the Trump administration, they're really worried about having actual value behind the United States. And this is part of what Jose was with the reindustrialization of the United States, getting domestic manufacturing back, getting gold back, and then cryptocurrency was part of all that.
I got a question about that, actually. Do you think that with everything that you just said, do you think the average everyday citizen, just like the regular Joe Schmo in America, is it still worth investing in precious metals, or do you think that's a thing of the past? We should just try to focus on cryptocurrency.
It depends on your goals. I mean, in general, the thing with investing is like at some point you have to cash out, and the question is, what is the cash out event? What are you saving for? But as a rule, like if all you care about is you're looking for plays, then I'll say that if the gold market breaks and the current price of gold is what is it now approaching like what $3,000 or something an ounce, you have 124 claimants that one piece of gold. So you have 124 people who all want that same ounce of gold, but you're the one physically holding. The gold price will spike. Like that's
that's what Groman's argument is, and
Yeah.
that's what he's saying, that the Trump administration is aware of what's going to happen. That
Mhm.
this false suppressing of gold and silver is eventually getting ready to break, and
Yeah.
therefore it's going to come down to who actually holds gold.
Yep.
That's the only thing that's going to matter.
Yep. And I'll say, historically speaking, so the thing is, the United States government has seized gold from people before. Well, I'll say they have not done that with silver. And I'll point out that, I mean, if one wants to make a play on market manipulation breaking, like if that's your goal, because, what do you call it? So the potential with gold is like what, 124 to 1 returns, which would be insane. But look at the silver market. You have 408 pieces of paper for every 1 ounce of silver. Now, of course, silver will be more responsive. So there were no new gold finds last year for new gold mines, but there are plenty of silver mines that would suddenly go active if silver was to skyrocket. So I don't see silver suddenly multiplying 400 times on a per ounce basis, even if like the whole market were to break. But what would happen? But it's still going to spike, and there would be a huge increase in silver mining that would happen as a response to that increase in price.
Right.
1 second.
I have heard people that are major advocates in investing in precious metals. They always claim that silver is the move to invest in because it's below the historic ratio between the valuing of gold. And so if you are a private citizen like us that maybe has limited funds, and I am not giving investment advice to anybody. I'm just saying what I've been looking at is they always recommend that if you just have, you're not going to be investing, tens of thousands of dollars. They say get silver, because silver is the one that when the market goes up, it's the one that if it gets back to its historical ratio, when it gets back to it, there's a echo somewhere.
Elijah's.
Oh,
so go ahead.
That when it gets back to its historical ratio with gold, it's the one that's going to go up the most for the average person holding it, wherever you're at in the world. But who knows? I own a little bit of both, but to the point that Jose was making, it's like, what is the point of saving is to be able to actualize it. And, I don't know what the goal is. And when you get into investing, I always feel frustrated because it's really about how much money you can invest. And if you don't have a tons of money to invest in the first place, it sounds like you just need to grind more.
Yeah, and it comes down to timing. Like the thing is, like, I have friends who, they were aware of Bitcoin in 2012 and they saw the opportunity and they took it, and that paid off really, really well. It's just the thing with success is, success, it requires a combination of talent, hard work, and then timing. And as a rule, my timing has always been terrible. So it's, that's true for business. That's true for investing. It's, you're not going to see 60,000% returns like with Bitcoin unless there's something new that comes out that none of us have any idea of, which, hey, if you see an opportunity like that, go for it. In terms of there, people I know who are into metals for the play of the breaking of the market. Some of these guys have been waiting for 3 decades because it's how long can the market stay irrational? And at that point, it's, can you stay solvent enough long enough to actually realize the gain when the market irrationality finally breaks?
Right.
And that's so some of those guys would have been better off if they had sold their precious metals in 2011, 2012 and bought Bitcoin. But if you already have that play, like we're just seeing right now the beginning of the breaking. So, that's the thing to take into account. So it's at the end of the day, you want that which is in your hand is actually yours. So if you have a gold ounce or silver bar or something in your hand, or Bitcoin in a cold wallet, that's actually yours. That's the and even technically speaking, like the money you have in your savings account, your bank accounts, those are actually the bank's, not yours. That's
Right.
just the money they owe you. That's so that's the thing. So like even if, there's a reason for physical cash on hand for emergencies. Even like, what do you call it? So Sweden was going the way of having a cashless society, and now they're reversing it because they realize, oh crap, the Russians can take out the entire internet system for us in literally a couple of minutes. And so they're now trying to tell people, hey, we need you to actually have cash, not only start using cash again, we want people to have emergency savings in cash on hand so that the economy can keep functioning when we go to war with Russia, which is why cash is never going to go away, because it actually is a national security issue.
Right.
Like if a society decides to go completely cashless, they're making themselves a vulnerable target to anyone for invasion.
Right.
And that's the thing. Like even if you look at, what do you call it? Old tech doesn't just go away. It's even take you can take the Ukraine SMO, where both sides cracked out wires from World War I for communications, like cabled wires. So why? Because neither side can intercept the other. You can have secure communications that way. So that's and someone mentioned here, chickens, that's productive power, and the list mentions that. Chickens are productive power. Herds of cattle, that's productive power. It's what matters. What matters more than having wealth is the ability to create wealth. And so first and foremost, when it comes to investing, the one thing I'll say is you'll never regret learning a skill.
Yep.
If you read bad books, then I learned when I was 12. There's no if a book is bad, there's no reason to keep reading it. But assuming you select good stuff and you learn good stuff, there's nothing wrong with learning a new skill, even if it seems useless at the moment. And things cross apply. Even I've been getting into playing Go, and I found out I've learned that Go actually does have a lot of applications I've learned principles from it that apply in UX design, and also a lot of military stuff, obviously, but even business negotiations. There's when you're playing with your opponent on the board, there's a negotiation going on between you and him over territory on the board. It's the same as in a business negotiation or negotiating salary. There's a give and take, and in understanding of you can't take it all, but what you want to do is you want to win on the attrition level, and that's so you never know how a skill set you learn will cross apply to another field, or give you new insight in the work that you do, or the next job, or may even open a job that you may have in the future. Like I've been cramming discrete math because I had the time, and lo and behold, now I know how Bitcoin functions. So it's that's the fun thing. You never know. You're not going to regret learning skills, and the journey itself is useful, even if it's a skill you'll never use. The fact that you spent some time focusing on learning something that was hard, and you mastered it, that's going to help you with just the very process of learning. So,
right. No, that's a great point. And this is why, getting back to an earlier conversation that Elijah brought up, is that real estate is one of the best investments in regard to the United States. And that's why so many foreign companies, foreign actors are buying up hotels, apartment complexes, anything that is of real estate, because it's a real asset, to Jose's point. So, if anybody doesn't have any more comments about the tariffs, I'd like to move into another topic regarding the Trump administration. And that had to do with one of the things that I'm most worried. Go ahead.
I just said, what's up?
Oh, is, thoughts on free speech. There's been a crackdown as of recent that I find a little bit troubling. And so when it comes to discussing the criticisms of the Trump administration, obviously our involvement and aiding and abetting the slaughter of Palestinians, I think, is atrocious. I think I'm against the bombing of Yemen personally, not to support the Yemenis resistance or anything like that. I just think it's another entanglement we don't need to be involved with. And from my understanding, somebody can correct me, it has to do with this resistant force firing at Israeli ships through the strait there. So this free speech thing in the United States, it began with one of these like Muslim pro-Palestinian kind of leftist students. I think was it at Columbia? And then he was deported, or at least he was in Louisiana, and he was going to stand trial or something, but he was a green card holder. And so he had legal permanent status in the United States. He was just shy of eventually, after the 6-7 years, you can become a full U.S. citizen. You have to examine all this stuff. But this is, we were obviously worried about the suppression of speech through the tech companies and everything that was going on before, let's say, Trump took office. And it kind of eased up once Elon took over X, or Twitter, now X. But now we're seeing the federal government literally be anti-free speech and put in a protective status amongst a certain group. and literally deporting people that have a permanent resident status. And I'm not even advocating for anybody that was deported. I mean, I'm all for cleaning up the country, but I feel like this is a very slippery slope. I understand that's a logical fallacy, but if we're being able to evoke people's permanent status in the United States as green card holders because they are critical of Israel or they're critical of what's happening to the Palestinians, I think that is a major, major concern. And especially if that becomes like official, which it sounds like it is, it's already affected these universities creating new speech codes. Official U.S. policy is you can't, there was a Senate hearing and they were talking about just claiming that potentially Zionist Jews have more loyalty to Israel than America is anti-Semitic and could fall into these new definitions. But what are your guys' thoughts on all the free speech and everything that's happening regarding the Trump administration? I find that very, very concerning.
I have one short comment. Jug the fuse. Jug the fuse. That's my comment. I'm going to spell it out for you.
Jab the fuse?
No, jug the fuse. The bagel people.
I don't know what that means.
Okay, you'll get it. You'll get it.
Well, here, okay. So, can I hop in here real quick?
Yeah.
Go.
So,
I get what you're saying.
So my thoughts are that look, I am not, pro-Israel, okay, in no way, shape, or form. I'm definitely not that. However, I actually don't think that even people who have a permanent residence status, first of all, I don't view them as citizens, just first of all.
They're not.
Well, I know, but what I'm saying is that a lot of people would want to treat them with the privileges that a full citizen might have, where they kind of morally view them as like an American citizen, even though they're on paper they're not. But I actually think that anyone who's in this country, period, when they are not a citizen, even if they are a permanent resident, I don't think that they should be able to have any say or any, I guess, privilege to try to influence political norms or societal structures in any way, shape, or form. I think that if there's someone who is a permanent resident, again, even if they're supporting a cause that I support and I agree with, my essential policy that if let's say if I was the president, okay, let's just say if I was the one who's in charge and I get to make these decisions.
Sure.
I think that anyone who's a permanent resident, they should be here with the understanding that these people are here to live in this country for whatever reason, and that politically speaking, they need to just sit down and shut up. That's my view. So I think that if there's someone who's not a citizen of this country going into universities and trying to do anything as far as influence political opinion, I would probably deport their ass too.
I'm actually not opposed to that sentiment. Generally speaking, I think the expanding of hate speech and certain definitions to make this potentially happen right now, I think that this is a fine line, because I'm with you in regards to all the student visas, all the things that we give people to give legal status to be here. Yeah, they shouldn't be getting in our politics and voicing opinions that could potentially, and where exactly this falls into free speech, as and maybe some of us here aren't free speech absolutists. I think you can make a case that orthodoxy isn't necessarily a free speech absolutist ideology. But it feels like we're moving in a trajectory where the expanding of the Overton window is now being used for a longer term goal purpose. And I mentioned this a couple years ago when Musk bought Twitter and the Overton window began to massively open, and criticism that was open in the public wasn't, the same a couple years before. that this was going to be used to actually bite people. And we're seeing the sort of the right wing kind of, eat itself to some degree regarding this specific topic. And I also agree that there's a problem with scapegoating. So there's so many things that can be true regarding the Rothschilds and all the stuff in that little Middle Eastern country that we talk about. And at the same time, it's not them that are behind all of your problems. Like, it's more complex than that. And I think that, God willing, as Orthodox Christians, we can say both. And we can recognize that things are much more complex than scapegoating. But there's obviously a power structure at play here that is incredibly influential. And my fear is it's getting ready to violate my ability to say certain things as an American citizen in the United States.
One thing I was going to say is it's amazing how that things are more complex and yet solutions can be very simple, and they're usually moral. So like if one's chief concern, like for example, like Thomas Massey points out, the level of influence that AIPAC has, like if that is something that one is truly concerned about, there is something you can do about it. That's very simple in your own life. And it's simply, one, do not give money to OnlyFans, and two, don't watch porn. And I'm dead serious. The number one source of funding for AIPAC is OnlyFans, that company. So like if one wants to support Palestine, all you got to do is just stop watching porn, and you actually will be contributing to actually helping Palestine, because you're not contributing financially. When you give money to something, or even attention to something, you're giving energy to something. Time, they say time, money is time, time is money. Money's the fruit of your labor, and like what are you directing your labor towards? It's amazing how simple it is. Like it's always a give and take. Even like with, people complain about the Federal Reserve, but in reality, most money that's printed into existence is loaned into existence via mortgage. So that's it's how the American system works. It always operates in the sense of buy-in. Since we broached the topic, like you look at the legalization of pornography, the Supreme Court that ruled it. So there are people who complain about how like the Supreme Court, has 4 Jews and 5 Catholics or something like that on the court right now, and there's no Protestants. Well, when the court legalized abortion and legalized pornography, the court was like 7 of the Supreme Court justices were Protestants. So it's not like, what do you call it? There's a spiritual thing, a pattern where you have to invite the vampire in.
Right.
You have to invite the demon in, and that's how you at a large scale, that's how a nation ends up entrapped. And even what's his name, the guy who wrote For My Legionaries, like even Corleone, he even said that when push comes to shove, the subversive Jewish elements, they only have power if people give it to them. If you have a swamp of sins within which that they can flourish. If you if you have a society that embraces the virtues and keeps in check the vices, then they're harmless. I mean, like you can even see this in the U.S. Like people complain about Jewish control of the media. I'm like, okay, well, look at when the U.S. was a moral society. What did Jewish production companies produce? They produced the Three Stooges. That was the Jewish element of Hollywood back there then in the 30s. And then once you have a rampant sexual revolution, that's where the subversion just goes crazy out of control. I just
want to say that I'm actually gonna head out. I gotta go coach some wrestling practice. So thanks for having me on, and I'll try to catch the next open panel.
All right, sounds good, brother. God bless.
All right, God bless.
Okay, so Jose, I want to piggyback on the last topic that related, let's say, my favorite people with, let's say, our sins. It's like the sin of usury is what's like giving them power right now, honestly. So if we basically outlawed usury, all of our problems of this nature would disappear as well. Because like for us to even get to let's say having the moral clarity to see how usury is destroying us would fix. It's the same conceptual problem in a philosophical sense. It's like usury is basically a weapon of war. And the moment you understand that like you don't want to be loaned on usury, the moment you understand that, you already understand that like the difference between in and out, between like what's my people and what's the other, right? The other. And in that sense, I would say yes, of course, like you said, it kills two birds with one stone, right? Like you become more virtuous, and also you remove power from APAC. But I would also say that even though, like, I agree with DPH's sentiment of like us being Orthodox not wanting to, let's say, lower the resolution too much so that we stop seeing, let's say, a certain people as not having, let's say, the image of God in them. I can also sympathize with a low resolution take that it's like, okay, these people, they always subvert wherever they go. Like 109 countries, let's make it 110, right? Like I don't see those two like things being opposed to each other dialectically. It's like I think that is something that needs to be rectified in the sense that it's always them. But I don't mean it like I have Jewish blood. It's always them in terms of like APAC. It's always them in terms of like who's for, let's say, the cocked right wing, like the Ben Shapiros of the world. Like it's always them, man. What can I say?
That's a little difficult to hold though, because I think if we're using the same standard, because you mentioned APAC, right? So if we're using the same standard in the US to judge like some area in Asia that didn't industrialize until 1990 or even 2005, like Ukraine was one of the poorest countries on earth at the turn of the century. That's always really difficult for me to accept.
Well, you know why it was poor, right? Because of the USSR, which was basically created by majority bagel people, right? Most of the communists, most of the people in the Communist Party, they weren't like disaffected Orthodox people. Like they were disproportionately.
No one can argue with it.
Because it's a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual thing. It's not a flesh and blood thing. It's a spiritual thing.
I don't disagree. I still just think that it's, if we know that a country like Ukraine comes in most ways, came from most ways from, this evolution of Bolshevik ideology, then in a lot of ways we have to sort of also accept where they land in the modern context of what that means.
Well, if you mean like if we're talking about Ukraine specifically, like the conflict that exists in Ukraine was born in the Council of Brest back in the 17th century when you had the formation of Uniatism. Even today, you draw the lines over what parts of Ukraine want to be part of Russia and what parts want to align with the West. It correlates with which parts are more Union, which parts are more Orthodox. That's just
no one can argue. I wouldn't argue that either.
Yeah, and even it's interesting how what do you call it? Both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, the one thing that they have in common in their writing is they both really, really hate Jesuits, and every single Jesuit in their works is a sneaky rat bastard. So, but yeah, that's because of what the Jesuits did in the Ukraine and in the frontier region of Russia when those parts were occupied by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
And regarding the general topic here, I think that we're also seeing, especially with like the Houthi rhetoric and what's going on in Yemen, is that there's certainly a play amongst the conservative right now to take the frustrations Americans have potentially with global conflict and place all that on Islam. Mm-hmm. And so when we see the rhetoric about Palestine and Hamas, and ironically ally with Al Qaeda in Syria, where they're killing thousands of Orthodox Christians. And so there's this dialectic
that's not institutional, DPH. That's not institutionalized though. That's just what people on the internet say.
What's not institutionalized?
We were just discussing that people were being deported simply for criticizing Israel, though. That's the context.
I know that's what you guys were doing. I know that's what you guys are doing. The U.S. has actually shown a significant level of support for, the Taliban government. Iraq is having like modern labor disputes and stuff, and these policy.
If you're talking about I agree with you. If you're saying that the U.S. government is allied with our perceived enemies, I'm talking about mostly within right wing. I mean, it's all propaganda, right? So all media is propaganda,
I
one way or
can't
another.
argue.
And so the frustration. I agree. We were sending what $40 to $70 million a week to the Taliban since we pulled out of Afghanistan. So no, I don't disagree with it being a false dialectic in regards to the inner workings of the federal government itself. But I think that the propaganda for the country at large is that being anti-Semitic, which is what the rabbi requested in the Senate hearing, and being pro-America are one and the same thing. And that the rhetoric, especially coming out of Pete Hegseth and his new tattoo, which this is what I'm saying is that there's a false dialectic within the mind of the American people, especially through the media, to choose between like Jew or Muslim. And as an Orthodox Christian, we have a historical perspective that we don't choose those sides because both of them can be problematic and are
I wouldn't disagree with that either. Yeah. I think some people look at like a place like, one of my favorite regions in the world is the Sahel. It's continuously supremely impacted by climate change, by delayed modernization. And in a place like Sahel, you have a ton of Muslims. You also have hundreds of NGOs operating. So there is a lot of global attention on that region. And so that's why I always reject a blanket statement, which is like, it sounds like, we're making the move against Muslims again. Okay, cool. If that's what we're talking about, the West is mobilizing against Islam for some reason. Let's not do that, right? Let's be a little bit more precise when we're making those types of statements.
Are you talking about us noticing what the rhetoric is, or are you talking about the disposition of the U.S. government? What do you mean specifically?
Well, the way we got here, if I remember correctly, was I was rejecting the claim that there's institutional there's that we can just make a blanket claim that there's institutional movement against Muslim nations. I think a lot of people in Washington.
No, I don't think anybody was making that explicit claim.
Believe that we'll both collaborate as well as compete with Muslim nations,
of course,
including Islamic governments over the next, and if we're going back to APAC, where is it? It's not Singapore, it's Indonesia, another really growing, fairly successful economy. In some ways there's some Catholic and Christian persecution still in Indonesia, but overall, like, there's someone the United States can work with. Like,
sure.
So,
but that's not the point we're making, because of the general topic was attack on free speech and what's being able to be
right.
What's being able to be said right now amongst the general American populace as conducive to the political scenario. And so what the point that I was trying to make is that you can say things about Muslims now and it be generally more accepted, but you can't do the same thing about Israel. And that it feels like, so when it comes to, because obviously the U.S. is tied with all the OPEC nations, so there is no animosity between the U.S. and the UAE or Saudi Arabia, and they all work together. But all those nations are also very friendly with Israel. And so when it comes to the conversation with Yemen and Iran and Assad, like, this has to do with perceived enemies of Israel. And it seems like it's kind of propagating the American populace to already assume one side of the dialectic between who Israel perceives as its enemies right now. And that feels like, especially with Christian Zionism essentially being the voice of Christianity amongst the Trump administration, it feels like dispensationalist Christian Zionist theology and the MAGA movement are kind of fused in one. And I just see that as problematic, because the fervor behind some of the critiques of people of being anti-Semitic is driven by a religious fervor.
Yeah, exactly. You nailed you nailed it, man. Because honestly, if you take a perspective that free speech is not orthodox, if you take the perspective that free speech is a modernist, like, Enlightenment ideal linked with democracy, then you take the perspective that the state wields the sword, right? Wields the sword and allows certain speech and disallows another one. So who's wielding the sword? Why are we wielding the sword in the name of these people? Why are we choosing to defend these people over, I don't know, for example, Orthodox Christianity? For example, why aren't we speaking, I don't know,
There's
for
been
the
no,
Orthodox?
So like the Trump, to your point, the Trump administration has said very, very little about the Orthodox Christians in Syria that have been massacred. And I'm Antiochian, so that is the head of our diocese is over there. And we've already made, like, the Patriarch John has already issued statements about how it's pretty dire, and what's happening. So, and I've made the point before, when you look at U.S. foreign policy since the bombing of Serbia under Clinton, Orthodox Christian communities have kind of got the worst end of everything when you look at what happened in the Middle East and some of these ancient communities. So it's from an Orthodox Christian perspective, this is part of a spiritual battle that Ivan was talking about that is tied with the greater Israel project.
That's not entirely true. There were hundreds of thousands of people in Afghanistan that had that were fucking starving after the U.S. invaded.
Who's denying that? I don't.
Yeah, who denied that? That is the question. The United States starved 1 million Iraqis when they went into Iraq.
I deny the hyperbole. That specifically, there wasn't a geopolitical context that naturally drifted into Islam versus Christianity in the 2000s and 2010s. I'm not denying that Orthodox Christians living in the Middle East, again, just sort of zooming out and then coming back into it, for Chad as well. I'm not denying that, they deserve universal human rights, and there's these values that we hold in the U.S. that we should attempt to secure for people.
I don't understand what the argument you're making against.
You said that Orthodox Christians had it worse, and I was just saying
that those communities, ancient communities in the Middle East. Well, let me just clarify. I'm saying those ancient communities in the Middle East, when we look at the invasion of Iraq, they basically got annihilated, and the same thing's happening in Syria. And these are very ancient, early Christian communities that are still intact and still thriving, and they're being desecrated. And my point is, when we look at U.S. military involvement, and the same thing's true in Russia and Ukraine, those are Christians. All right. Does that guy, was he not understand what we were saying? I thought it was pretty straightforward. Did you guys?
I think he's baked.
No, okay. I think he was like taking it from a perspective, like a neocon perspective, that, well, in 2001, like with the war on terror and this and that, the U.S. was basically mobilizing against the Muslim world and this and that, and he was arguing against like a dialectic that we don't even hold. Anyway,
Caravaggio says he ducked your argument.
Yeah. Just to go back to the original question in terms of essentially what's happening with like the Palestinian guy at Columbia University who's now getting deported. It's fascinating to me in that, me being brought up in America, I was taught in school, Baptist school, public school, Catholic school, Jesuit school, and I do consider Catholic school and Jesuit school to be two completely different ball games.
Yeah.
But the
anybody's met a Dominican versus a Jesuit can attest to that.
Yes,
they are very different.
Yeah, and the what do you call it? I mean, the Dominicans I had a positive experience with.
No, me too. They're super Aristotelian, philosophical. Like they are much more reasonable.
Yeah, what you call it? The gist is I was taught at all these schools, essentially American civic nationalism, that America is a collection of ideas, etc. And the thing I always found odd is, well, if it is a collection of ideas, why don't you have any kind of like civic tests to make sure that the population actually holds to those ideas? Because if you want to have an idea-based nation, then you literally have to exile anyone who is not who does not hold those same set of ideals. And this is the first time where you've actually have an ideological test being used with, in this case, a permanent residence. I just find it to be very interesting, because that's actually what you would need if you wanted to have a civic national, civic nationalism that would actually have any hope of functioning.
Right.
The question is, like, are you going to exile, the third of America that hates America, to Canada? But yeah, that's what I find to be very interesting. Now, in terms of precedent, like, yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if it spreads to actual citizens. Like, what's going to, if there's the real thing to watch out for is when there's an actual targeting of American citizens for holding wrongthink.
Well, did you see I don't know if you guys follow, but Jordan Peterson was affiliated with a study. It was like 13 scholars. And it was talking about the rise of right-wing anti-Semitism. Did you follow this? Because it attacked Candace Owens. She did a show on it.
No, I did not.
Yeah. So this was in the last month or so, and I'm kind of blanking. Some of the people in the chat are probably going to know some of the details more. But essentially, there was a study that was examining right-wing influence online, and most of their study was focused on X and how much engagement certain posts and people were getting. And it highlighted that these people that promoted anti-Semitic messages were getting some of the most engagement in X, and then highlighted various people that got the most engagement for anti-Semitic posts and stuff like that. And this is where a study that officially stated that, Christ is King was one of the search terms that they used to determine like if anybody posted that. And like Candace Owens and I think Jack Posobiec like posted Christ is King, and they got some of the most liked posts. But anyways, the study then analyzed, and then it was differentiating in the like right-wing conservative movement, those who are not anti-Semitic and those who are. And it was labeling like Candace Owens, Jake Shields, I think, and included Jack Posobiec, but it had this weird claimer like, although he posted like an anti-Semitic trope, Jack Posobiec meant it in like a Christian, heartfelt, sincere way. And that was like how they caveated. But yeah, they include anyways. So my point is, in regards to U.S. citizens, is that we do have an example of a recent study that Jordan Peterson then promoted. Even though you look at his engagement is going way down on his X account, but it was essentially going and attacking American content creators for this type of rhetoric.
It's interesting to me that, it's like, 'cause these people are fundamentally gatekeepers and they keep focusing on them. It's, I just find it to be very amusing because, it's, what do you call it? I mean, like these people who try to study, like, quote, study the right wing. It's fascinating. Like the people who they're truly afraid of, they will never draw attention to.
Yeah. Ian Carroll was another one that they try to label. And what he said in it, they were referring like to posts he said in like his Joe Rogan appearance. There wasn't a lot there. I mean, it was mostly he was talking about Epstein and quoting a lot of what's her name down in Chile. She wrote the book on Epstein and doing the one on the PayPal mafia. The chat's gonna know who I'm talking about. I'm having a brain fart right now. Nobody on the panel knows who I'm talking about. Whitney.
To be honest, I just came when he was talking about that. The Middle East and stuff, and I just wanted to say hi and go back.
Whitney Webb. Okay. So he was quoting Whitney Webb's research, which was not anti-Semitic. It's just drawing the connections between Mossad, Israel, the CIA, and MI5 and 6 with Epstein. But anyways, I just bring that up because I think it's something worthy to be concerned about with what's going on with the Trump administration and the Christian Zionism that's being explicitly promoted through their faith office. But to the next topic that I wanted to get into was, unless anybody wanted to say something else on that, I was going to get into the Ukraine-Russian conflict and what your guys' thoughts are at the Trump administration and how that's being handled, where you think it's going to go, that type of stuff. So feel free. Anybody wants to dive into the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Yeah, I wanted to say just two things about like the whole Christ is King thing. It's definitely anti-Semitic, but in a positive sense. Like in a positive sense that like Christ is King, and like bagel people, like, you hate Christ, so please back off. And they're sniffing around. They're sniffing around trying to like corral the right wing, like, and they invent terms like the woke right. And this is just like an attempt. It's like this when the snake starts, your pet snake starts like stretching next to you to see if it can eat you. Basically, that's basically what they're trying to do. It's like they're trying to sniff you out, they're trying to mark you, and they're trying to persecute you politically. And we should not like budge from that. So, and those were my.
And I totally agree with you. And what I think is interesting in regards to the dynamic is that it's not working for the young people. So just making like an academic taking my opinion out of it. It's just like that is where the energy is amongst the millennials and the Gen Zers online. And I think so that crackdown and that marking is certainly taking place. But I think what they're going to have trouble with, and we've seen this with like the Daily Wire, if you guys have seen recently, like they're cutting like tons of their staff. Boring is out. One of their other head executives is out. Ben Shapiro, they all are like cutting part of their staff. So you look at like Ben Shapiro's engagement versus Candace Owens, it's not even close. It's not even close. So I mean, if we go right now to Ben Shapiro's YouTube, it's probably getting like 10 to 40,000 views a video, and Candace Owens is getting 1 million plus. So anyways, getting into Russia, Ukraine. Welcome, Nadeem. Good to see you, brother. God bless you. What are your guys' thoughts? So we've voicing some criticism. One of the things that Trump ran on was he was going to be a man of peace. And early on, we saw him already contact the Kremlin, establish connections again with Putin, and it seemed very promising. And then one of the representatives went over to Moscow and spent time with them. No peace deal, no resolution came about from it. But this last week, it felt like Trump's rhetoric kind of shifted. Now, he was still very optimistic in regards to getting a deal with Putin. And somebody highlighted in the chat that Lavrov and Putin have also been very complimentary to Trump, which is something that plays very well with him, as we all know. But what, 2-3 weeks ago, he kicked Zelensky out of, well, probably more than that, probably a little over a month now. He kicks Zelensky out of the White House and calls him a dictator, calls him a half-rate comedian. And then this past week, he's defending because Putin says that he's not going to, sign a peace deal until there's a new government in Ukraine because it's not legitimate, which is true. They haven't held elections. And that he won't negotiate with Zelensky. And Trump, again, just a month ago, was talking about how they have to hold an election in Ukraine. And then this past week is then like criticizing Putin for saying that he won't negotiate with Zelensky and wants a new head of representative in Ukraine. And I'm just curious because Trump's rhetoric is that he has some type of leverage over Russia. And maybe you guys see something I don't, but I don't see where the U.S. really has leverage because of the sanctions since 2022. The Russian economy is essentially operating just fine outside of like the Western economic sphere. So what are you guys' thoughts on Trump, and how would you grade him? How would you rate this negotiation or what's involving in Ukraine and Russia? Because it seems like maybe his rhetoric was very upfront to begin with, but it's like softening, and I haven't seen anything moving forward. And then you have Starmer in the UK and Macron in France, and you have Sweden, and they're acting like they're going to go to war with Russia, which is suicidal. They don't even have militaries that could do anything. So what are you guys' thoughts on all this?
Yeah, well,
I think definitely, like, I think a war with Russia from the Western standpoint is not something that will happen anytime soon. That's for sure. But I think Trump's rhetoric is still a bit too, like, it still leans a bit more to like Putin's side. But to be honest, I think he isn't fully pulling the strings anymore. I think it's more he's losing grip to the bagel kind of enforcement, more the JD Vance, the Elon Musk, the PayPal mafia, whatever those players are having much more influence on Trump's decisions than we would have thought. But I think we talked about this as like a possibility, and I think it's playing out. I don't know what you guys think. But.
Yeah. I don't know if Trump has a strategy. I think he's playing hardball. I think he was a little bit offended that Putin stated the obvious, that basically you need regime change for any deal to happen in Ukraine. And I think Trump wants, because he's proud, he wants to be the one to decide that, not the one to be told that. So basically, I think that even though it was completely normal for Putin to say what he said, which is basically, look, I'm not going to deal with this idiot who just lost the war with me. I need someone who can make concessions for me, because this guy is too invested in his stupidity and will die on this hill, even though I've already defeated him effectively. So just put someone in place that can basically grant me what I want. And now you have like a power struggle between, let's say, the US wanting the minerals and Putin saying, hey, I actually won the war. So basically Trump is like trying to swoop over like the dead carcass of the Ukraine and say, no, I'm still a stronger player here. And maybe that's not right, but I think that's the card that Trump is trying to play, which is basically, look, I'm big, I'm strong, and I can fight you over this. But honestly, I don't know if it's going to play out very well. He's already toned down his rhetoric, and I think he's trying to check what he can get away with, right, in terms of negotiating, because I think he's like saying these inflammatory things to see what the response is, to see if he can get away with it. But I don't know, maybe you guys have more info or a different take on it.
The person to compare him to is Nixon, because Nixon got elected on the anti-war platform, and historically, the Republican Party has been the anti-war party, ironically. But the pro-war Republican Party came about in the 90s. The thing with Nixon, though, is Nixon decided he wanted to end the war and just pull out. And then he got convinced by the CFR effectively that he should try to look strong instead of just looking like he's running away with his tail between his legs. And he made the mistake of trying to have a negotiated end to the Vietnam War instead of just pulling out. And that resulted in him being associated with the Vietnam War, and essentially its failure being placed on him. And Trump is running the same risk of having the war associated with his name. Because he has not just simply pulled out. And the fact is, at a strategic level, the war has been lost since March 8th for the West.
Right.
March 8th, 2022. And it's everything since then has just been, playing out the inevitable. It's like a go match where you can count, how much points each side has, and you decide to keep playing, even though you've already lost. That's effectively what the administration appears to be doing right now. But the other element, so that's the big risk, and that'll be a huge mistake if, politically speaking, inside the United States, domestically, if his name gets associated with the war, because Americans are turning against it. I remember people being very gung ho about it in 2022, but Americans lose interest. While they tend to be very, in my experience, from what I've seen with the Iraq War, Afghan War, even the war in Kosovo. Most Americans around me tend to be very enthusiastic about the war initially, and then after like a year, 18 months, they lose interest and they get bored of it. And that just appears to be just a common thing that I've seen repeat throughout my life over and over again. So that's the big risk that he's taking domestically, of being involved, of having his name tied into a war that's unpopular in the home front. The secondary part is there's this impression that the State Department, they're trying to force a ceasefire and then have negotiations, right. And which would be absolutely stupid for Russia to do. When it's like that's not how it works. That is not how it works when you're rolling on the mat. You don't. You tap. You get essentially, if you want negotiations, you got to tap out.
Exactly.
And the U.S. is not, and they don't want to tap out because, and again, they don't have an incentive to necessarily tap out because it's not. There are some American mercenaries who are dying, but it's mostly, someone else's babies who are dying. Right. And the U.S. doesn't mind that. The U.S. has historically used many peoples as battering rams, be it the South Vietnamese, the South Koreans, Colombians historically have been used in like even the Korean War. United States would requisition Colombian troops and just deploy them at different parts. There's a famous Battle of Old Baldy, if you want to see, if people are interested in looking into how the U.S. historically has used Colombian troops in wars that Colombia has nothing to do with. It's just something the U.S. has done to keep their own body count low. Is always use someone else's children, right. And so there's no reason for them to necessarily tap out. And the thing is, like, what do you call it? It's from Russia's perspective, like if the war has to be fought to the end, then they fight it to the end. And the fact is, every Banderan that dies on the battlefield is one fewer Banderan to wage a guerrilla or terrorist campaign in the future. Like that's for as far as the Kremlin concerned, it's just a part of denazification from their perspective, and they'll have a population that will be more loyal to the Kremlin that's left over. Right. And as one can see, Ukrainians were not exactly, while they love, while they're, I know Ukrainians who are very enthusiastic about, they're loyal to the idea of Ukraine. They weren't loyal to the Ukrainian government. That's why the population of Ukraine just fled.
They all
fled the
moved.
state instead of
Well,
staying.
and Ivan and Nadeem might be able to speak to this, but I know multiple people that live in Europe, and you go to major cities in Europe, and there's tons of Ukrainians, and they're driving nice cars, designer handbags. It's like, obviously, we already know that Ukraine's been a money laundering operation, but it's amazing to see all these Ukrainians in Europe and how much money they have and are spending.
Yeah, I if I can speak on it, because I go to a Russian parish that is full of these people. Like, I've got a lot of Ukrainian chicks who are like super, super patriotic about Ukraine, yet they fled. Some of them left their boyfriends. Now they have new boyfriends. They have new boyfriends while the boyfriends are like dying in the trenches. And like, still they're so patriotic, yet they left, right? Like, yet they left. Meaning, it's kind of an idea. They like the idea of the economic prosperity that the UE, like the European Union, like is selling to as a propaganda tool, because there's no real like economic prosperity. Like the EU is like completely dying. It's completely dying economically. Like it's being like let's say starved. Like it's taxed to death basically. And the Ukrainians,
it's where the wealthy elite utilize their money. So I think the stratification between the classes is so much more intense in Europe than it is in America. I mean, and our middle class has dwindled greatly, but there still is a middle class. And we don't have, in the working class, middle class, that distinction is not so strong in the United States like it is in like the UK, identity. I'm working class, I'm middle class. That's kind of blended in the United States, but we still have that. And that's really what the populist MAGA movement's about. But you go to Europe and it's just like everybody's on the same level. And then you have immensely wealthy people.
Yeah. What I would say is that it's like Europe is like socialism for the rich, right? So you import like immigrants who are going to live like 10 people in one apartment, like, and for nothing. And this is a way to funnel money into, I don't know, the cafe owner who employs these people for cheap, right? And you can still get like, and you have like the upper middle class people who are like, oh, but now I can get my cup of coffee instead of like at this price to this price. But basically what you've destroyed is labor for like your own native population, basically. Mm-hmm. So,
and it's also destruction of development of labor. That's actually a very big point, because you look in the United States, like, for example, fast food jobs, etc. This used to be worked by teenagers, even like a harvesting in the field. So like I've talked with people who were lived in, America in the 1950s and 40s. Like during your vacations, they were out working in the fields. That's who was doing in the work before they brought in masses of Mexicans to work in the fields, or in Central Americans as well. So once they brought in immigrants to do the work that teenagers previously did, essentially what you essentially created a tradition where you have your young people not working for money, not developing skills that are actually useful in the labor force, as teenagers. And that's part of, not of course, usury plays a much bigger role, but that's part of the reason why a young man cannot afford your average young man cannot afford a family at 20 years old.
No.
And that's something there was one observation that
I don't even own anything at 20 years old.
Exactly. And then, I'm reading about the Byzantine Empire or, Tsarist Russia, and like your average 20-year-old peasant was better off in that sense, in that they'd have their own house, their own wife, and, their own family. And I'm like, this is, sure, they were peasants, and, it's like, but like they actually had family life at 20, and they were not like in debt, up to their eyeballs to some bank. It's absurd. It's absurd to, it's absurd to think that like the entire concept that we're better off, like in, truly better off. Like, yeah, we have technology, we got other stuff that's cool and all, but like, how many men, how many men want to have a family, and it's just something that's financially out of their reach.
Right. Well, what you're mentioning too is part of the underlying fundamental narrative of modernity. Right. And this is where I mentioned this in my dissertation, actually, is that orthodoxy as a pre-modern worldview has a similar critique as the postmoderns, and that the narrative of unending linear progress that modernity and the Enlightenment project is built on, which is the fundamental presupposition, is no longer true. and that technological and economic progress does not correlate to moral progress. And so for the postmoderns, that's like subjective happiness, right? But for Orthodox, we're saying, well, it is still true. I mean, you look, there is no moral progress in man since the modernist project has emerged. In fact, it's gotten worse and more debaucherous. So Orthodoxy takes a similar critique. It's just that we don't do away with the traditional metaphysics. We still say, yeah, postmodern critique of unending linear progress is true. Therefore, we need to return back to a worldview before modernity, the pre-modern worldview of orthodoxy, which allows the traditional metaphysics, but also values subjective experience, because our epistemology isn't built on rationalism. It's built on noetic knowledge, which is found higher than rational knowledge. And therefore, we privilege subjective experience. We don't deny it. It's not a secondary aspect of human existence. It's fundamental. It's how we engage with God. But we also have the entire metaphysical paradigm that allows for empiricism.
Yeah, completely agreed.
I think I can relate to like what Jose and Ivan said. I think it's not only in the Western kind of perspective, but I think it's even like poisoning the kind of Eastern cultures that are even close to Orthodoxy or even not. But I can say, for example, in Lebanon here, that like half of the jobs that are normally for the lower class or middle class are being given away to like Syrians or immigrants from the Philippines or Sri Lanka or Africa or whatever, and it's actually doing the same effect just on a lower scale for like young men or young women or whatever that build a family at a young age is impossible now, even in a country like Lebanon, which has the value of the dollar, which is way higher than in any other countries, which is mind-blowing, because it's supposed to be way easier for young people to build families, but actually no, because half of the jobs that would have like lowered the debts or helped someone get a hold of housing is actually being used by people that are coming from thousands of miles away. So like that's also like a critique to immigration, which is even
the globalization is built into the modernity. And even if we didn't have the globalization, to your point with the kind of corrosiveness on family values and building families, is that's the case for the entire planet, right? When we look at the birth rate. So that's another lie of modernity, where that, again, we can hate postmodernists, but we can also recognize that the critique is accurate regarding modernity, and that as modernity's progressed, actually families have declined and birth rates are a perfect example. And that's true in China. That's true here. That's not just a Western civilization. That's like a techno-modernity for some reason. And we can obviously speculate about what those reasons are. A lot of people have written about this, but it just leads into like a narcissism where people do not focus on like transcendental values and family structure, or even have the opportunity, to your point, Nadim. So, that's, you look at like what countries are thriving, it's those that are recognizing this and trying to make it better for people to actually build families. That's the race.
Yes, definitely. What I wanted to add to that, and then go back to the original question, which was about like the war between Russia and Ukraine. Yes, there is a problem with the min-maxing, with the whole trying to get the best deal, and like globalization, like destroying identity. So now a nation does not distinguish between, let's say, a native born and a foreign born. So now there is, let's say, a lack of social cohesion that is established because of economic relationships that, let's say, favor the employer over the employee. And that leads also to the loss in productivity. You guys were talking, UTPH and Jose, you were talking about productivity. You were talking about economics in the sense of like something tangible, something that is productive. What is more productive than having children? Like, yeah. and I mean this in a very practical sense. Even if you don't want to take, let's say, an elevated spiritual view, I need soldiers. That's the body politic. That's what like solidifies an identity. It's like, how
soldiers that solidified identity that are under the same sacred canopy, to your point.
Yes,
because I think what we're seeing is that there's certainly more and more soldiers. You look at Europe, but they're not under the same canopy of values and symbolism and transcendental vision, it's very different. And so now we see soldiers amassing, but they're on different sides of the battlefield. And so to your point, though, Ivan, the point that you're making, that's what we do need more children, because we need soldiers brought up in that general term, brought up under the same sacred canopy that have traditional Christian values.
I think even modern modern people that are after the modern young men that are after being part of a sort of a military or army that become soldiers are actually seeking more of a materialistic stability or something that they would have had if there was a stable non-modern kind of concept of society. So they wouldn't even have been soldiers if they had the possibility of building a family or owning a house or having a stable job or something that isn't as easy to acquire nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I wanted to add before, like going back to the Ukraine-Russia thing, I've heard Trump say something along the lines that he wants the justification for the mineral resources is that he wants to get back what basically the U.S. has given the Ukraine in terms of like money, weapons, etc. And like this reminds me a lot of what he said regarding like Mexico will build the wall. And when he said those things, like a lot of people were suspicious, but then I actually did a little bit of calculation and it was like, no. If Trump like basically started, let's say, a tariff war with Mexico, Mexico would lose that war because Mexico actually needs a lot from the US.
I think we buy like 60% of Mexico's goods.
Yeah. So anyway, what I was trying to say with all of this is that I get the rationale of like the U.S. wanting to get back what it has already given, but in a sense, that's kind of a self-denial, a denial of the fact that the U.S. is a democracy. You can call it a republic if you want, but basically you gave away those, like Biden gave away those funds, and it's moral in a sense for Trump to want to get those funds back. But in a sense, it's like, sorry, bro, you were given that money, like you were giving that money to the Ukraine. Now, like the idea, Zelensky is offended because he thought he was getting free money, and I'm sorry, bro, there's never free money. Like the only one who's that generous is Christ, and he's not gonna give you money for those kinds of things. So, like, I get all of the positions. What I don't understand is what will happen in terms of, let's say, Trump. His interest should be like getting Zelensky out of power. Honestly, like Zelensky has nothing to offer. Like who even supports him? Like what you need is from both sides. Like
Western
from
Europe, that's about it.
Western Europe needs him as a stooge. But like if in the U.S. and Russia's interests, what I would say is like take Zelensky out, put someone who like can be bought and just like duke it out. And I don't know what will happen exactly, but I think that would be the best scenario, like to get someone who is not beholden, let's say, to the people, because Ukraine is already conquered, and the ones who are conquered don't get to dictate the terms, honestly. And that's like, it's history. That's life. I mean, you lost. And I think that would be the best way to stop the conflict, to stop like people dying for nothing, because honestly now the conflict is already decided. I don't think that the US is going to start like a nuclear war with Russia. I don't think that the EU is going to like marshal all of its forces and fight Russia. Now even you have like the Wall Street Journal, I think, like admitting that like, yes, the Ukraine was a proxy war, but it was a good thing that it was a proxy war.
Right.
Like, but too little too late. It's already over. Right. It's
right.
Nothing else is going to develop. Like it's not in Trump's interest. But I don't know if you have anything to add on that topic. But
well, I kind of said my piece. Unless Jose has something extra, I was going to read some super chats and then get into the next topic, which was going to be China.
Yeah, I know. I was just going to say quickly that the one thing I like about what's referred to as the American School of Economics is it's the first system of economics I've ever read where the issue of children and family life comes up. And so I really do. I mean, if you have the IQ capacity for it, I do recommend, or the reading ability, I do recommend Friedrich List and giving it a read, because the fact is children are the engine of production. Like the whole entire reason men work is to support their families. If there's no family life on the table, men stop working. Men stop working, then your society will fall apart. And that's what's happening in the United States. You know, they have that phenomena that they're now talking about in the news. Like, there are all these men who've just checked out of the workforce and they're nowhere to be seen. How are they surviving? So I can tell you from my own experience, like when I was a single man, like generally speaking, when I was a single man, I could live comfortably off of $800 a month. You really don't need much when you're a single dude and you have no debts. Like you don't need much at all. And if you really want to, I knew guys who literally even lived off less because, they had access to land that they could hunt on, and a bullet is pretty cheap. At least was before the sanctions on Russia. So so what you've had is, once no fault divorce became a thing in the United States, the phenomena of men checking out and not working has started then. And it literally starts then. Since no fault divorce, you just see the line growing of the number of men of working age men who just completely check out. Right. And the reason they have no hope of a family life, no hope. And these are men who are, shall we say, lower on the attractive scale. And there's just no hope for them having a family. So they check out. And that's why American society as a whole, and the West as a whole, American society in particular, is doomed. If you have men checking out like that. And that's why you have this now being brought up in the news, because they're going to try to figure out what can we do to get these men to work, instead of just do what they have to do to just barely survive. This was a problem that with the Roman Republic was happening. And that's why they passed bachelor taxes and stuff like that. Yep. None of that worked. The thing that caused reproduction to happen again, family life to happen again in the Romanian Republic, when you had that civil war after the assassination of Julius Caesar, who was assassinated not for forgiving debts, but because the oligarchs were afraid he was going to literally do a debt jubilee. That's why they killed him. And his heir, Octavius, so what's his name? Mark Antony had the money, the population that he could tax. He had Egypt. He had all on paper. He had the productive power. He had the money. He had like everything needed to win that civil war. And Octavius, pulled off a brilliant thing. And he was like, okay, I'm going to restore, if you guys fight for me and, I become this, the autocrat, I promise to restore, pater familias. Essentially, men automatically own their children. No more no-fault divorce, and you own your family. And young men just flooded in and volunteered to fight for Octavius. And you may have all the money, but if the other guy has all the young men who are the ones who actually fight, guess who's going to win? And that's, Octavius, becomes Augustus Caesar, as mentioned in the book of Luke. You have a restoration of paterfamilias in the pagan Roman style. And if people want to know more about the distinction, there is a version of paterfamilias that's orthodox. It's not like, for example, so in the pagan version, you could literally kill your own wife and children, and you were considered like totally king of your household, tyrant of your household, and can do whatever you want. That's not how in the Christian Roman Republic, Christian Roman Empire. You can read this Code of Saint Justinian. Like, men were kings of their household, but you couldn't kill your son. So it was pagan what Augustus Caesar restored, but that's how the Roman Empire was born, when young men, the Republic was falling apart because young men were just checking out, and working age men just kept checking out. Why? Family life was not on the table. Right. And once that was on the table, like really genuinely on the table, there are a whole bunch of men who are like, screw democracy, screw voting, screw the Republic, I'll go with an emperor. Right. And that's what happened.
It's a great point. I want to come back to that because Pete Hegseth in a recent thing talked about how the U.S. military in all divisions is filling its recruitment goals for the first time in like 10 years. So I want to come back to this in just a second. I want to just hit some of the super chats. H. Brossi threw in 10. Thank you so much, brother. He said, just rewatched a few old streams of you and Jay, the OG stream on Reformed theology when you were beardless back in the day, and the red pill joint. One thing I've noticed is you're perpetually mewing. No Diddy. What's mewing?
I think it's when you put your tongue in a certain way to make your jawline more appear.
No, I really don't. This is all natural, H. Brossi. So, had no idea what that meant, but I can assure you that has never been a conscious thing being online.
It's actually
thank you
healthy
so
for
much
it to be an unconscious thing. That's how our jaw is designed to be. Like you're technically speaking, one should be mewing unconsciously. Like it shouldn't be something one has to learn. But because of how, like, what do you call it? You have a lot of kids who are simply not breastfed long enough. They were, and their food quality is so terrible, people don't do it naturally anymore. That's why, like, if you look at the bones of our ancestors from the 19th century, their jaws were much stronger in men than they are today. But yeah, it's not just, what do you call it? Like it's not just the food itself that's poisoning you. It actually changes how the modernity, the way that we're living, is actually changing how our bodies function unconsciously, which causes
it could be one of these, H. Brossi, too. I do use the Jawser and I didn't know what mewing was, so this is new to me. I appreciate the terminology. I can incorporate that, but
I guess DPH was breastfed. That's why
I was. I wasn't aware. It looks like I do that most of the time. I actually put my tongue on the roof of my mouth and kind of suck so that it lays flat on the roof.
I think that's mewing. Yeah, that's mewing.
I would, to what Jose's point, I was reading that just by the mouth breathing, that a lot of the Gen Zers, that they're noticing a shortness of the lower jaw. So I Jawser and keep my tongue. So when I sit here, usually that's what I do. So I only breathe through my nose. But I can assure you, I did not realize people could perceive it as mewing. Apparently,
that's mewing, bro.
That is mewing. Oh, that is mewing. Okay. Okay. I guess I'm guilty as charged. Then H. Brossi was right. So Austin throws in 20. Thank you so much, Austin DeTulio. Says, good to have you back, brother. Well, feels good to be back. Really appreciate the support. Thank you so much. And H. Brossi has another one. Let's see what he says this time. He says, this is the biggest problem with open panel. Damn, dude, we all agree about the tiny. Exactly. You can't say it on the platform or he'll lose his damn channel. Chill. Damn basement dwellers. Well, and when I booted him, he left an endearing message calling us the N-word in the private chat. So that was the last thing he was able to get out before being banned. So I have no idea who that was. If you guys have seen, what was it, like MC Nemesis or something? No idea who that guy is. But thank you so much, H. Brossi. Shout out to David James Flood for gifting a COTEL Crew membership. Jaden Day throws in 5, says, any book suggestions on Imperial Russian economic? That's a Jose question.
Yes.
Sounds interesting. What Jose was saying.
So I got 2. So, I mean, one, of course, is, I recommend List's magnum opus. As I said before, he does have a section on Russia. And it's interesting because List says, like, in general, more freedom or less autocracy, more freedom equals more economic growth, except for Russia, who are the one giant exception. For some reason, autocracy just works really, really well for them compared to French autocracy or Spanish autocracy, etc. Essentially, List admits that Orthodox autocracy works way, way better than Catholic autocracy at promoting industrialization, but which I find to be hilarious.
He gets into the Byzantine stuff and Orthodox stuff in that book.
Not the Byzantine, just the Russian. I wish he would. It'll be fascinating if he actually went into the Byzantine stuff, because the Byzantine Empire is fascinating economically. And then the other book that I would pair with it. So this is the Romanov Royal Martyrs. So it's
tilt that forward a little bit more.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. So this book is mainly focused on, focused on like the saintly life of the martyrs themselves. They're not just saints because they were martyrs. They actually really were, they were living saints before they were martyred. Now it's mostly focused on them as people, but they do touch on both of Saint Tsar Nicholas II's military policy, as well as his domestic economic policy a bit, in terms of how his pursuit of virtue, how that influenced his decision making when it came to war and when it came to economics. And it's really fascinating because it really clicks well with what Friedrich List wrote back in the 1840s. And so you can see how, essentially, in a nutshell, Tsar Nicholas II did the American School of Economics far, far better than the Americans did. And it's kind of crazy to think about, because like the whole premise of Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, is the idea that the workers will seize the means of production,
right?
And yet in Tsarist Russia, 95% of industry was in the hands of the laboring class. They had literal worker co-ops, being like today, how many manufacturing industries are worker co-ops? Like, it's very few. It's not 95% like it was in Tsarist Russia prior to the Bolsheviks stealing everything. So those are the two books I'd actually recommend. One being, it's Orthodox work. The other's, economic theory work. But those are the two I'd recommend as starting points.
Great. And we had a follow-up question. This was over on the Dono chat, but I'll say it just because it's related. He says, shout out to Eric Vigilant. He says, hey, COTEL, Ivan, Jose, and Nadim, is there any book recommendations on these topics y'all have covered on the stream? We've kind of covered a lot of different topics. Was there anything in particular that you guys thought? We've kind of hit on a lot of different stuff. I don't know. So I would just follow up by saying, like, the economic questions that Jose was addressing. Check out those books. Most of the stuff I referenced were recent interviews and news articles that I saw. So anyways, thank you, Eric, for that. Shout out to Justin Hinley, gifted 1 COTEL Crew membership. Thank you very much, Justin. And Austin DeTulio throws in 5 more, says, send in the super chats now. And I do second that opinion. So thank you so much, Austin. And Nadim renewed his membership and throw us a little bit of a wave. So thank you so much, Nadim. Glad to see you again, brother, and that you're here. And then Bitter Klinger threw in 5, said, for a well-deserved post-dissertation adult beverage and the good stream. Thank you so much, Bitter Klinger. And what he's referencing is, I mentioned earlier for anybody who just joined, that I was able to finish my dissertation and it is complete. And I'll be sending that to my committee tomorrow. So I'm super excited to finally have that potentially wrapped up here soon. Oh, and Nadim throws in another one. Shout out to Nadim. Throw 2 Orthodox crosses. Appreciate you, brother. God bless. Okay. So with that being said, the other 2 topics that I had planned for today, and we can get into either one of them, was one. Oh, did Nadim just pop out? Was one concerning the American empire and thoughts on Trump as expanding the empire. What the thoughts were to that, and then the threat of China. Those are the 2 that I had left. What are you guys' thoughts? Dive into either one of them if you want.
Yeah, on my part, I would say that I think Trump has a rhetoric that is anti-imperialistic, but in practice, he's not an anti-imperialist, and neither would I. I mean, I'm not judging morally or whatever. I'm just simply saying, like, I myself, being an imperialist, I think that the populist narrative, I even see it in Europe right now. Like, you have a lot of, let's say, populist politicians. I think that's just a lie. I mean, these guys, they want technocracy. Like Meloni wants technocracy, et cetera, and when they get to power, they still like do the same thing that the other people do with their own twist. So, like, and I don't mean to be like too unfair, too strict, but I don't see Trump as being really anti-imperialist.
Well, and I brought that. It would have been cold if I donated and left, but I was just lagging. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I bring it up because my thought was obviously, I agree with you that the rhetoric is like anti-imperialistic. It's about bringing, troops home, ending wars, peace, all this different stuff, even getting out of NATO, which he's threatened. I doubt that he will. But with the bombing in Yemen, and the big news was them messaging on Signal. I don't know if you guys followed this story. It was big news. What was it, 2 or 3 weeks ago? And they're essentially, the controversy was whether it was actual war planning or not. But the messages did specify, and a liberal, very pro-Zionist journalist was brought into it, and he was able to access it. But we see Hegseth like literally talking about blowing up Yemen, some of the people that they're going to strike. And the only person that voiced any concern was Vance, and saying, like, this is not necessary immediately. Why don't we come back to this in a month? The situation is going to be the exact same. And yet we see that Trump had supported Hegseth and going ahead and, doing multiple airdrops, explosions, missile strikes in Yemen, claiming to be successful, which I highly full of based on, the history of Yemen. If you, they've been fighting for the last 200 years there constantly. So I highly doubt they made any real impact. But some people speculate this was a way to sort of strike terror in the heart of Iran. Whether that was successful or not seems to be up in the air, but it feels like some of the imperial dimensions of the American empire, especially in the Middle East, are still in full effect. And that I wanted to bring that up because it's like this weird tension between his rhetoric that is more nationalistic and populist and more pro-peace and domestic prosperity. And we're seeing movement. We've already discussed some of the tariffs and the industrialization and all this different stuff related to that. But when it comes to the Middle East in specific, it seems like it's kind of business as usual. But what are you guys' thoughts on that?
I was going to say in terms of like
it definitely is. I don't know if you guys were following, but there was a presidential election not long ago in Lebanon, and this actually was a deep portrayal of how our country has completely fallen into the hands of the US. We're like a very big embassy is being finished here. The president that was chosen was formerly the general of the army, which is like a basic thing that the US does in countries that they want to control. They just give power to military leaders. And now it's been a month and a half, and the repercussions are starting to show. It's as usual. It's like they started like a sort of technocrat parliament. All the stuff that we kind of know happens when the US comes and controls, and that's the rhetoric, at least in my head, is either our country is going to be war-torn or it's going to be controlled by the US as a puppet in any way, shape or form. So it's not that's what basically happened in Lebanon, and I think that's what they're trying to do. That's what they did in Jordan, and that's what they're trying to do in Syria. And so I think that's the part I know more about. I know in Yemen, it's not gonna the attacks wouldn't do a thing. It's not there isn't anything major they could do that could actually affect the Houthis.
Right.
So I think there's definitely a shift now that they're kind of making it look more obvious, and people are buying into their narrative, and then they're having the repercussions come, and they're I think the idea is just to make a country as pessimistic as possible, that they could accept anything that the US throws at them, and they'll just accept it as a good thing. But to people that are more aware, they'll see how actually cutthroat it is, and it's going to shatter a whole culture. So that's my own perspective.
Jose, what were you getting ready to say?
Yeah, so in terms of criticism of both criticism and a prediction of how American imperial power is going to go. So I wanted to compare it to the essentially Confucian Chinese Empire. In that, in the last 2,400 years, China has waged exactly 2 offensive wars. They were the largest empire of the world throughout most of that time period, up until the end of the 18th, early 19th century, when the British Empire surpassed them in size. So they got huge without waging tons and tons of offensive wars. And there's a Go proverb which doesn't just apply to the game, but it explains the Chinese attitude of how they function imperially. And it is, a rich man doesn't start wars. A rich man doesn't start fights. If you're the rich man, you don't go around starting fights. Why? You have way more to lose. Doesn't matter if you're more
unless you're the Rothschilds.
Yeah, but it's essentially, in terms of longevity, it's like if you go around starting fights, even if you're most likely going to win, eventually you lose, and you'll lose everything.
Right.
And that is what's going to happen to the United States. And this is why, you look at Western empires, they don't tend to make it past the 300-year mark, because they tend to engage in lots and lots and lots of war, and they use the wealth of the empire for that, for that military expansionism, adventurism. And that's why the Chinese empires managed to hold together over, essentially 4,200 years because they don't engage in that.
Right.
They literally wanted, like, it's interesting to see how, like, looking at Chinese history, like they actually wanted their neighbors on their borders to thrive in a way that America simply has never wanted on its borders, or to be frank, in the whole hemisphere of the Western hemisphere. The Chinese emperor literally gave, birth, the states of, the Korean state, the Japanese state, the Vietnamese state, even though that's the one state they had a lot of conflict with historically, and the Thai state, etc. Like all throughout that region, like even in Southeast Asia, a lot of the states that formed were promoted by the Chinese, because what the Chinese wanted, from the Chinese perspective, if your neighbors, a different nation, let's say like the Koreans, if they have a stable state of their own, you're not going to have, lots of border raids happening all the time. You'll have a trading partner, and the Korea functions in case of the Koreans, they functioned as a buffer between the Chinese and the Jurchen tribes. So it's it's China historically, in their model of empire, they look for win-wins. Whereas, unfortunately, you can see this in Trump's rhetoric, where it's, America must win. And I agree, like, yes, from an American imperial perspective, yes, America should win. But, if you want to have an empire that's going to endure, if that's your goal, then you want to find win-wins where client states actually want to be underneath you, or fine with you being the suzerain. And you want to have it where minorities within the empire are actually loyal to the empire and will rush to fight it, like in the case of Russia today. You don't see that. And America does the exact opposite. And it's that's why its empire is doomed, because it has built immense animosity with multiple other states. It picks fights with states it never had to begin with. We didn't have to go to war with Afghanistan and Iraq. We didn't have to be in the Middle East even, but what do you call it? In the words of John Adams, he even wrote that one of the purposes of the U.S. Republic was to establish a Judean state in Palestine. It's just this crazy. The Schofield Bible, yes, it was Rothschild funded, but that idea of what the Middle East is now and what's happening in the Middle East was formulated long before then. Yeah. The Schofield Bible was merely the thing to sell it to the public, just like the book Exodus by Leon what's his name, Undris. I have one of his books, actually, as I'm studying it for studying, propaganda essentially. But he wrote a book called Exodus that was published in 1957, and that's what sold all of non-evangelical America among the boomers, as well as the silent generation, on support, like just 100% support for Israel. That's why, you have the non-evangelical Americans of boomer age who are Democrats who still, support Israel fanatically the way that they do. It's what do you call it? Essentially, the American empire, because of its fundamentally its heretical underlying heretical beliefs that it has, it simply can't not pick fights that it's eventually going to lose. It can't not waste its wealth, waste its industrial power, waste its manpower. It's and that's the sad thing, because America is in a position, like geologically speaking, America is in the position to be the China of the Americas. Like it could have dominated the Western Hemisphere forever. And the ruling class of the empire are insisting on choosing a path which is going to result in the empire fractioning, just the way that the Western Roman Empire did. Right. And the Western Roman Empire never came back.
And to your point, I think that it's a spirit of Antichrist, like that self-destructive spirit, right? I mean, and when I say that term, I mean it very generally. Like somebody who's addicted to drugs and commits suicide is led by the same spirit. But I'm saying, just generally speaking, and we can see the empire of America, to your point, that heretical belief and its unification with the zealous religious elements of Israel and the Greater Israel Project. I think this is all part of a spiritual unfolding. And to connect you and Ivan, this is where I think that the potential, and it seems like it's going there, war with Iran. And I've done multiple streams talking about the church elders and saints, talking about as soon as the nuclear facilities of Iran are bombed, that's the beginning of the Great War. It seems like that's ramping up, and that's what I mean with Trump. It's like he's not a traditional imperialist, and he's doing things to try to pull us out of sort of the overextendedness of the U.S. empire. But at the same time, because of the heretical belief that you're talking about that underpins the American project, it's like it's ultimately destined for self-destruction. And I think that the major domino that's going to fall is the war with Iran, because that's going to eventually bring in, it may not immediately. And I've been listening to Colonel Douglas McGregor and Scott Ritter's kind of take on what's happening in Yemen. And they don't feel like Russia and China have totally solidified themselves with Iran, because they would be voicing opposition in like the UN Council and stuff with things that are going on. And because they've been so silent, they take that as maybe there's been some type of negotiation that's been taking place, and that in some extent Iran's on its own. So if that's the case, maybe my prognostication and trajectory of where this is going is wrong. But my thought is, bug just landed on me. My thought is, if China and Russia were to get involved and we did align ourselves with Israel and start a full-blown war with Iran, I think that's the last domino of the American empire, and it's all going to fall from there.
Yep, and that's the Syracuse expedition of the American Empire, of the American Republic, and it'll go down the same way the Athenian Republic did. It overextended itself. The Athenians, when they became the top dog among the Greek city-states, it's just the nature of republics. They don't know when to stop, and part of it is downstream from the madness of mobs. But part of it too is, functionally speaking, we humans were built to live in hierarchy, and what do you call it? When the hierarchy is incomplete, or in the case of America, like outright rejection of hierarchy, people go nuts. Like people just go crazy, and there's no you lose the unity within the society. And that's the thing about America right now. That you don't have the unification. You don't even have. There's no longer a common culture anymore, and that's and I know Trump has pushed for making English the national language, but it's great that they're for Americans. It's great that you have someone who's trying to push back on that. But the problem is, again, if the U.S. overextends into Iran, even if Iran is on its own, the U.S. is not winning that war. Right. And while the U.S. would not necessarily die because of battlefield collapse per se, it's the economic impact of that on the homeland that a war with Iran would have. That is what would take
and all the sleeper cells. And it's not that, and I'm not even saying Iran would win the war. I think they would be annihilated, but it also come to the detriment of the United States as well. And I'm not saying that Iranians aren't great fighters, or that they would be able to preserve something. I'm sure they would, but just based on my opinion, just the schematics of the arsenal between these two powers, that they'd be dependent on Russia and China backing them. But to your point, Jose, about the tearing of a singular American identity, I think that's partly what this Trump phenomena is, with MAGA and the immediate pushback, and even the general support by the American population regarding deportations and LGBTQ and men and women's sports. That seems to be like the last vestige of America's trying to voice some type of normative understanding of the world and reality and how society should work. But the recent, I was kind of blown away by this. CNN's been talking about the decline in support amongst liberals with the Democratic Party, and it's reached like an all-time low. It's like 28 to 25%, depending on which poll you look at. But CNN asked the follow-up question, are you frustrated with Democrats because they're not doing enough to stop Donald Trump, or that they're working with him? Because this was after Schumer, the whole extension bill, which I agree with Massey was probably very problematic. I also understand that Trump didn't want to be hamstringed right when he got into office with a shutdown government. Anyways, because Schumer and some of the Senate Democrats went along with that whole thing and acted like they're going to stop it, but then didn't. The question was, are you upset because they're working with Trump or they're against him? And it was 77% that they were working with Trump. They wanted, or that they weren't doing enough to stop Trump. And so from that perspective, that then demonstrates that the divide in the American populace is like getting more intense, because it's not that the Democrats, they are hemorrhaging people more towards the center, but the people that are still with them are more leftist than they were, and they're upset because that this whole phenomenon is occurring. So to your point, it's like the MAGA, whatever that thing is, and that tent is being extended. Obviously, we have like Scott Pressler, the guy that gets registers all the votes, and he's posting photos laying in bed with his boyfriend, who's like this like alpha male gay dude. It's weird, and this is all like part of the MAGA conservative movement. But to your point, what I was trying to say then is take a larger perspective and see how the culture, like you're saying, is totally divided and is actually going in opposite directions. So people that are more centered are getting more conducive to Trump and the MAGA movement. But it's getting less conservative as that process is happening, which you would expect.
I'm sorry to cut off. I have to go. Thanks TPH for having me. It was good seeing you.
Thanks for the support, Nadine. Good to see you again, brother. God bless you.
Yeah, it's very good to see you guys. Bye.
Later. So,
by the way, I wanted to say a couple of things. By the way, I met Nadim the other day. Like, he came to Madrid, so we met in person.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. So I wanted to say a few things on that topic, which are basically piggybacking on what Jose said about, let's say, empires. Like, if you're a strong empire, you don't want to wage war, except if you're an empire that is being ruled by a banking elite. Because if your money comes from finances and not the real economy, then actually war is profitable for you. Because like you're skimming off the top. Like if everything is destroyed, you don't care. Like you just rebuy the ashes and start. It's a way to concentrate power. And like, if you take a perspective like from a monarchical view, like the monarch is above, let's say, sacramentally above the rest of the nobles, but he cannot bully nobles, right? He's not supposed to bully nobles in the sense that if you start bullying nobles as a king, you're going to get your head cut off. And the problem is that Trump is exactly the kind of tool that a banking elite wants, which is a person who wants growth, eternal growth, right? Let's keep expanding, while they themselves like keep enriching themselves. And that's why I brought up my concern before about, let's say, the populist lie, in the sense that I think that the people, because it's inherently against the interest of the people to go into a war, right? Like, I don't want to lose my children, I don't want to lose my money. Why am I fighting for these things? Like, what are you talking about? National unity? Why are these my national interests? Like, we're fighting about a piece of land somewhere else. Like, so I have to die. So what my country? What is my country? Right? Like, those kinds of questions start bubbling up, and you see that the whole unity that you have, like the coalition that is governing you now, like basically doesn't hold. And I think ultimately that it's going to play out exactly as you said, DPH, in the sense that like we're going to keep getting, let's say, these anti-imperialistic candidates who are ultimately imperialistic, and they're going to give us like the crumbs from their table, which are, okay, now you get some deportations here and there, you get we relax a little bit on the LGBT stuff, we relax a little bit, but still, like, it's business as usual. Like, yes. That's perspective.
No, and to your point, and I was going to bring this up in the imperial, and we're still in that section. We can talk about China now if you guys want, but the Greenland purchase, the talking of Canada being the 51st state, like this is, although it's like he's nationalist populist, that is certainly American expansionist rhetoric. And I can understand the geopolitical reasons why that would be advantageous. But there's so much that needs to be done domestically. I mean, if you just drive around the United States, some of the roads, depending on where you're at, like we just need so much investment domestically that doesn't seem like it needs to be a priority right now. But to your point, it's like I
just had to bring up the book again because structure is so important. Like, even, and the problem is, the my backyard people have such weird attitudes too, where like I'm having dealing with this locally. So there's a plan to expand like a railroad here, which would be actually fantastic for reindustrializing this area. Because here's the thing: the lifeblood of small towns was railroads,
right?
And if you want a revival of small town America, you need railroads. That's what makes things, transportation, bring those transportation costs cheaper. You can have good jobs, good wages, all that fun jazz. And unfortunately, a lot of people are fighting against it, and they want more lanes on their highways. And it's like, no, you idiots. Like it's yeah.
Well,
Anyway.
and another thing to your point, and I'm not an expert on this, so I'm talking a little bit out of pocket, but there's like major regulation in regards to shipping like into the Great Lakes that it used to be before mine. It has something to do with our inability to own the things that are like moving in and out of the Great Lakes, where we used to be able to, and we like sold these rights off, I believe, in like the 1970s. And so now we do not make the money trading like we used to. And that's why all those cities around the Great Lakes, like Milwaukee, Detroit, Chicago, Gary, Indiana, South Bend, like they are no longer what they used to be because they're not making the money from all the trade that was coming in through the ports. That'd be another huge thing that would revitalize, like just the, like you said, railroads and shipping.
Waterways. Yeah, shipping and waterways. And that's the thing too about America. Like the American Mississippi River Basin, like it is the most extensive like river network for transportation. Like it is the best thing that exists in the entire planet. And if that were to be utilized, like literally the entirety of the interior of the United States, like Frederick List's dream of a state, like he dreamed of, because he was German, he wanted this for Germany, but he said like America is the most best position, like geographically, to have this distributed industrial agricultural system, which would maximize productive power because of the Mississippi water. And he's talking before, railroads were becoming a thing, but river transport is even better than railroad. It's just it's cheaper.
It's cheaper.
Yeah. So railroads are like almost as good as river transport. And the thing is, like Russia for its like development of Siberia, it has to develop these railroads. That's the best they can do. The U.S. in theory could actually do it better because God gave it this massive Mississippi River basin, and it's just never been properly utilized, which is it's so sad. It's the which is why it's a good thing that with the rise of the Trump administration, there are talks among Americans, like especially American economists as well. I'll generalize it more, Anglo-Saxon economists, to include Steve Keen over down in Australia. But there is now talk of like the U.S. actually needs to have an industrial policy, and this whole laissez-faire thing is with no planning whatsoever is actually pretty stupid. Because when you think about it, if you're running a household, you're the father of the household, you're the head of your household. If you have no plan for your kids and you just let them do whatever, is that household going to be as efficient than if you were a father and you set a goal and you gave your kids freedom to choose path to get to that goal? Right. That's the fundamental problem of laissez-faire economics, and I have to go be a dad. So I'm
Yeah. So I wanted to say one last thing on this topic of imperialism, which is that like Jose was saying, and like I was trying to allude to in terms of like the whole push towards unity, and like imperialism is a push towards unity. It's an expansion of one identity. And the idea is that like if you're a good ruler, like you're not going to be like trying to meddle into like the minutia of every little thing. Like if you have, let's say, vassal states that are next to you, you don't want to mess with their way of dealing things as long as they have, let's say, a spiritual connection with you. And that's why spirituality, I think, is so important in the sense that you need to purify spiritually. You have to like take out all the, let's say, for me, the biggest sin that I see in terms of an empire in the West is usury. I see the financialization of the economy as the biggest roadblock towards the West becoming, let's say, a potentially good empire. Because you want, like, if you're an imperialist like me, you want your empire to be good. You want it to like.
Well, and to your point, that's the big difference between what Jose's bringing up is that the monetary system through usurious central banking, which the entire Western world's built upon, is about the issuing of debt. So it's not about that. Power, that prosperity of power that he was highlighting with like chickens and farm and agriculture, manufacturing, industrial support within the nation. So it's like to your point, I totally concede that the usury is what has hollowed everything out because it's all about financial profits at the top end and a total hollowing out of the production in the central or middle part of that pipeline and even beginning part. I mean, we see the attack on farmers right now. So yeah, to your point, it's like the West isn't financially even set up because of the central banking usury for what Jose's mentioning about like actual power prosperity in like real products, real investment in real things.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah. And I want to build on that with the the profit motive, because the thing is, when you're a society where it's all about just maximizing profit, then what you see is you have maximal rent seeking being usury, and just anywhere where you can collect a monopoly profit, for example. And the problem is that completely distorts your society. It promotes laziness. It destroys families, and it removes the incentive for the common man to work.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's why even List makes this in his criticism of Adam Smith. Michael Hudson, he comes from his heretical version of Marxism, which I would define as oddly, like, what do you call it? Like an odd cross of Karl Marx with ancient Near East in terms of his approach to money and the role of economy and government. But in a nutshell, it's what you want. The profit motive. A market is a tool. The profit motive is a tool, and what you as the sovereign, if you're the sovereign, what you want to have is the profit motive be there to encourage people to be more productive and to produce stuff that benefits everyone, not just siphon off monopoly profit for themselves.
Right.
And that's the that's the fundamental problem with the United States. It is a banker's paradise, and and banking is not the only form of that's usurious or rent seeking. The entire insurance industry.
Right. That's what I was thinking. Insurance, the medical industry.
Yes, and that's the crazy part, because I've done the numbers on it. So if the laws that exist on the books that are on the U.S. Code, if they were to be the antitrust laws, if those were to be enforced against the medical industry, big pharma, the giant hospital chains, all the way down, if you were to actually enforce those laws, you would cut medical costs in the United States by about 80%, and that in turn will cut the cost of medical. So not only that would make Medicare. So the big giant, people talk about Social Security being underfunded. Believe it or not, Social Security is actually okay. Like, it's going to have a cut in terms of the benefit amount, but the amount that'll get paid out, the system actually, like, Social Security is actually, technically speaking, okay. The problem is Medicare and Medicaid, where Social Security is like 87% or 84% funded. So the gap is like 16%, like 1/6. Medicare and Medicaid are funded 1/6. The gap is 5/6. It's underfunded. So if just from enforcing the antitrust laws on the books alone, you cut medical care costs by 80%, that means with the same level of care provided, Medicaid and Medicare's budgets suddenly or expenditure go down 80%.
Right.
And that makes them both nearly solvent from their current status today, where they're the primary drivers behind the explosion in the national debt. And so it's sad to me that's why I said definancialization is the next step. Tariffs alone are insufficient to reindustrialize the United States. You have to definancialize, and that's not just debt jubilees to reduce. Like, I know most people won't. We don't have the time to go through it, but believe it or not, the government public debt is not a problem actually yet. What is a problem is private debt. Private debt is a big, giant, massive problem that's going to prevent economic growth. You have to reduce the amount of the portion of people's discretionary, or the portion of people's income that's going to service debts is insanely huge. And that's what has to be shrunk down so that, money can then go towards productive activity. Instead of just servicing debts that are going to some banker who's just collecting unearned rents, essentially,
right.
or what the classical economists would call unearned rents.
Right.
It's
and to your point, that's where I don't see Trump as an antitrust guy, and maybe that's part of the shortcoming, because he's so proud of people that sort of get to the top of the pinnacle in regards to the monopolization of corporate investment. So he kind of valorizes the people that made it to the top, and he wants to make a deal with them, not so much undercut or dissolve their monopoly. He's like, oh well, why don't we just join forces and let's make a deal.
Mm-hmm.
So
I would say I want to jump in there, because that's a very good point, but I would offer a little bit of pushback in the sense that I think that a system like a medieval system would have inherent monopolies. Let's say if you have a workers' guild, like the guild system is a system of monopolies in a sense. So the problem is not corporate. How do you say corporate? Well, to have like almost like the fascist system, which is like corporation, is like you see the state and the private sector fused together. That's not the problem, because a monarchy is actually that. Like, a monarchy is like the monarch deciding, okay, you, my nobleman, you will get this part, you will have to do this, but you respond to me, right? It's like a personal relationship. The problem is not that you have like a monopoly. The problem is that the monopoly is run under like free market principles. It's run under like let's say a secular worldview.
The thing to account though is the guilds were heavily regulated, so that you couldn't take a monopoly profit. Like like in the Spanish, in Spain or in England, which are the two I'm most familiar with in the West, like they couldn't take monopoly profit, at least not until England went Protestant. Then you had monopoly profit becoming a common thing, and that caused huge issues. Yeah, so it's in this case you're thinking of like the thing is, but even with the monopoly, even if you could earn monopoly profit as like the shoemakers in France or whatever, you're still producing a thing. Financial monopolies, you're not actually making anything,
right?
And that's the fundamental problem. It's the non-productive versus productive. And actually, for a while I was wondering, why is it that Michael Hudson is the only, like, I'm used to every Marxist I hear just being wrong all the time, like without exception. And then along comes Michael Hudson, and for some reason he gets things right. And I was trying to figure out why, and I finally figured out like a month and a half ago why. And it's because he takes the Marxian class analysis and he changes it. So instead of like rich versus poor, white versus black, the capitalist versus the laboring class, he literally redefines his version of how he refers to proletariat and bourgeois. Like he completely redefined it, where the proletariat is those who do productive work, and he includes business owners. Like he actually has a whole thing on defense of like, no, someone who builds an industry that produces things, he's actually earning from his own labor. Like leadership, in his own words, like Michael Hudson said, leadership is labor, it's work, which it is. Right. And so, the CEO does deserve compensation, and he does deserve, so it's ironic. He defines the CEO of Ford as being part of the working class in the proletariat, whereas a banker, whether you're a lowly bank teller or the guy, Rothschild family guy who owns the whole thing, or Morgan or Vanderbilt, then you're actually part of the bourgeois that's unproductive. And so he essentially took Marxian class analysis,
redefines it,
and then redefined it through a medieval lens, a medieval and ancient Near East lens. And I'm like, okay, so this is why you're actually getting things right on a case. Like usually he's hitting more often than he's missing, and that's why practically every other Marxist in the world considers him a Marxist heretic, right? Because he considers a guy who builds an industry. He doesn't consider that man to be a bad guy. He considers him to be a good guy and a productive member of society in his heretical version of Marxism.
Right. That's a really interesting take. Want to give a shout out to Frankie D. threw in 5 and says, you aren't getting the Epstein files. Yeah, I'm very skeptical whether we'll officially get those. You aren't getting the JFK files. Well, we got some. Not all of them, but some. We're told that there's more that are going to be released. You aren't getting no IRS. Yeah, I don't suspect that's going to happen. You're getting W. Bush Endless Middle Eastern War 2.0. Yeah, well, fair enough. I'm pretty skeptical on I've been pretty disappointed with Pam Bondi, generally speaking. Not sure what other people's sentiments are. And then Frankie D throws in another one, says, I wish people who had the warrior inclination were propagandized to believe that supporting every war was patriotic. To be a patriot means to preserve the Volk. Yep, agree with that. And Blue Skittle throws in a very generous $50 super chat over on Dono Chat and says, DPH mewing without even knowing it, without knowing what it is, Chad. Well, thank you very much, Blue Skittle. I had no idea. Thank you for Ivan for bringing me up to speed on the vernacular here. And Anonymous throws in 10, no comment. Thank you very much, Anonymous. So welcome, S. Paez. Is that your name?
Dude, I'm mute. I'm mute, bro.
What's up, gentlemen?
So
I'm sorry. This is my first time on a stream. Sorry to make it weird. I'm mute, bro. What's up, gentlemen?
I think you got the YouTube video on.
Yeah, you got to mute the YouTube video.
There you go.
Sorry to make it weird. I'm mute, bro. What's up, gentlemen?
I think you got the YouTube video on.
Yeah, you got to mute.
You still got the.
I gotta. Can I just close the tab?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the YouTube tab.
DPH, may I make a small comment? Like someone was asking before if they.
I can't hear you guys, by the way.
Okay.
Go into your settings.
Oh, he can't hear us. So
he can't hear us. So, like, in the interim, someone was asking about like book recommendations and such. Like, honestly, I wanted to shill for a movie. I just watched There Will Be Blood, and it was fantastic. It was honestly a really good, interesting movie. And it shows a little bit of the dynamics of like when somebody else wants to stick their finger up your pie, you know, and like what you have to do as a man. Obviously, the main character is a little bit kooky. I don't promote his way of living, but if you feel, let's say, that there's something missing in terms of masculinity in movies, that's a very masculine movie to watch.
It's on the list.
Yeah, I haven't checked that one out. I think the last topic we were going to get into was China and assessing the threat, because that's obviously a big piece of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration. And I was going to make a point earlier with.
Sorry, let me give this another shot. Can you guys hear me? I can't hear you.
Yep. We can hear you. Can you hear us?
I know I can get off the stream if this is too much trouble for y'all.
I mean, can you turn your camera on? We can hear you if you can hear us.
What in the world? Background noise.
It should be down at the bottom. You just either start or stop the cam.
I'll just get off the stream. I'm sorry.
Okay. So we're talking about Jose brought up the point about recruiting with Augustus Caesar, talking about recruiting the younger people to be part of the military. And I was going to connect that with Hegseth's recent rhetoric about how happy he was that the U.S. military is reaching its recruitment goals for the first time in like a decade or more. I think it was like 15 years or something. And a lot of this posturing has to do with the threat of China, and there's talk about Taiwan. And I believe that one of the Taiwanese billionaires is investing billions of dollars in the U.S., and they want to make something to do with Japan as well. I'm totally missing out. But Japan also. So Japan and Taiwan are making some type of an investment to secure themselves against this threat of China and further expansion. But what are your guys' thoughts on the real threat of China? I recently had a conversation with somebody at church, and they were under the suspicion that China is the most major existential threat to the United States. And I mentioned that I felt, in regards to my prosperity in life, it feels like the Israel lobby and us getting involved in the Middle East is actually the biggest threat. And this was a point of contention. And so I wanted to bring up not so much the Israel stuff, but how severe do you think China is an existential threat to the United States? Because clearly they are wanting to become the global power. They've been, I mean, in the last 20, 25 years, I mean, China's totally lifted themselves out of the position they were in. So what are your guys' thoughts on that?
I'll let Evan go first if he's got anything to say.
Very briefly, I kind of respect the Chinese. Like I had a big animosity against them. Like I was the typical like normie right winger who was like, oh, but there's no freedom there, and there's system and this and that. And now that I'm looking at it, I mean, okay, it's a worldly system. I hate the way they view the world, but I kind of respect it in the sense that it keeps alive a lot of concepts that I think are very old world, and they're trying to like apply it in the new world in a way that is working. So in that sense, it's like, I think that rather than think of China as an enemy, you could think of it as a rival, right? As a rival in terms of like a worthy adversary, right? That would be my way of viewing China.
It's what do you call it? So historically speaking, China has never sought to, like, they essentially want peace, prosperity, and where they can just, be Chinese. Historically, like they've had the opportunity to, they could have colonized Europe if they wanted to, and they chose not to. Like they literally sent a fleet in the 15th century that mapped out even the New World. Like there's a map from 1450s, which includes North and South America. Part of the reason why the natives were so friendly to the Europeans who showed up was because the Chinese showed up first, and the Chinese were pretty friendly because they weren't looking to conquer anybody. The Chinese, what do you call it? They're not a offensive conquering power. They never have been. They're being forced to. And the reason is because China never, even when they were conquered by the Mongolians, their overruling class quickly, sinified. But what happened with the essentially the century of humiliation? The Qing dynasty was destroyed and destroyed, and China was utterly destroyed by the Anglo-American establishment, the Anglo-Saxon Empire, with the Opium Wars. So the Emperor of China actually ended the opium completely within China, like where he just said, death penalty for dealing. And he completely ended the opium trade in China. The British were not happy about that because they were the world's foremost drug dealers since the 17th century. And they launched the opium wars to force the market open so that they could push their dope everywhere. And that was the plundering and downfall of China. And the fact is, for the last century and a half, the biggest threat to Chinese existence has been the Anglo-American Empire, even before it was ruled by the small hat lobby.
Well, and to tie it into that, I mean, Mao Zedong was funded by that same Anglo-American empire. So
correct. He was a Rockefeller man.
On how they view that as Chinese, because if you've been to China, Mao Zedong, like you go to a hotel and his portrait is on the back wall.
Yep.
So there's still like a veneration of him. So depending on how they view that, but even to your point, I mean, the West was entirely involved with the communist revolution, the Cultural Revolution.
Mm-hmm. It's I mean, in terms of that history, like Mao he was a Rockefeller man. He was on the Rockefeller payroll. He was a Yalie. He was a member of Skull and Bones, just like George Bush and John Kerry. He was literally part of the same power structure. That's who and what Mao was. My grandfather was a mercenary for the United States, which meant he was essentially a mercenary for David Rockefeller back in the 1930s. And in his words, Chiang Kai-shek had to pay for weapons. Mao got them for free. So that's, and he flew, he flew supplies to the Flying Tigers. He flew the Hump, through the Himalayas in a DC-3 Douglas. Anyway, he had crazy stories. But in a nutshell, Mao is very interesting because Xi Jinping has no love for Mao. And the reason is because Mao destroyed his family, destroyed his father, his mother, his sister. Some of his family members died at the hands of Mao. And Xi himself lived in a cave complex as a young man in exile so that he wouldn't get killed. So he has no love of Mao. And the problem in ruling China right now, essentially what you have in China is you have things being, Xi's essentially redefining things. So like you have the Communist Party of China. Is it communist? Even in the words of Michael Hudson, no, there's nothing Marxist about it. What is the leading text, economic text for their economic thought? It is literally this book. Like this is the book that they read. That is the Politburo's textbook. They no longer read Marx. They read this guy. They were like, all right, Marx is dumb, and the American School of Economics, we're going to do that. Wang Hunan, who's the chief ideologist of the Communist Party of China, is he a communist? No, he was never a card-carrying communist. What is he? He's a Neo-Confucian. And by Neo-Confucian, Patrick knows this, but for those not listening, Neo-Confucianism is like what, 2nd, 3rd century? It's very old. It's a very old ideology,
right.
Ideology / philosophical religious movement in China.
It's an entire societal, philosophical, quasi-religious worldview.
Yeah. And so that's Wang Hunan. And there are many things that are being walked back and redefined. Even like if I was reading Xi Jinping's speech at the first memorial of that he spoke at for a memorial for the Nanjing massacre. And his speech was literally repeatedly, he was saying, we must not hate the Japanese. We must not hate the Japanese. You should not hate the Japanese. And he just keeps saying this over and over again throughout his speech. And it's, I'll just say, people talk about things being blown out of, like, exaggerated, we'll say, in the, we'll call it the conflict that happened in Europe. In the same war in World War II, I'll just say there's a lot of exaggeration that's happened in the Pacific theater. And frankly, Wang Hunan and Xi Jinping have already, if you read them, you'll notice that things are already being walked back in terms of claims. There is a push where Xi is not just trying to get the Taiwanese to flip and join into China. He wants to pull Japan off of America. And to do that, you're going to have to admit some truths about what actually happened in World War II, and he appears to be willing to do so. It's just things are done slowly in terms of redefining things. Because even like, okay, so the diehard Maoist of the factions within the Politburo, when Xi Jinping first became party secretary, the Maoist faction was led by Bo Xilai. He was the guy who got knocked out, like more than a decade ago. He was the one who was pushing. He republished Mao's Little Red Book. He was just going hard on how China to be great, it has to go back to being, purely Maoist. And Xi Jinping destroyed him, completely destroyed him. Then you had another faction was the Young Communist Leader faction, who are Marxist-Leninist, and they don't have much power anymore. Xi has stripped away their power. True. The neoconservative / Trotskyite faction, which was under Jiang Zemin, literally Xi Jinping in one night, he took out the entire private army and private secret police force of Jiang Zemin, stripping him of all his power and breaking his structure. And then of the Shanghai clique, most of the Shanghai clique ended up going and throwing in, like including Wang Hunan, throwing support for Xi. So essentially you have a redefinition of communism where they now call communism the communism they follow is communism with Chinese characteristics. What does that mean? It means it completely rejects Marx. It completely embraces Frederick List, and it rejects pure.
But it's still the mandate of heaven, right? Like,
yes.
like Chinese political history is always about the centralization of power and having that sort of imperial, the mediator between heaven. And I think that's the, if there's any remnant left of the communist Marxism that you're talking about, it's really that, which is why China, and maybe you could make an argument about Tsarist Russia, but certainly China, why it was so appealing is that it was like a secularization of that ancient impulse within China for the full centralization of power.
Correct. And in Wang Hunin's own words, China has to desecularize. Wang Hunin is an interesting character because he was very pro-Western. He was actually capitalist as a young man. He wanted China to Westernize, and then he actually came to the West. I think it was 1987 to 1991, where he was here as a guest professor teaching. I forget. I don't remember if it was the University of California system, but wherever. But after the 4 years he taught in the United States, he goes back to China and he immediately starts teaching and telling people China must not Westernize. We have to go back to like old school Neo-Confucian principles, and the West is going to completely self-implode. He predicted that back in the 90s, he predicted that the West was going to embrace gay marriage. He also made predictions that the essaying of children would be legalized in the U.S. in the future. I mean, in the 2020s. Right. And frankly, I mean, given who our last president was and how he treated his own daughter and his granddaughter,
admittedly in her own diary that then the FBI covered up.
Yep. So it's like, it's Wang Hunan. He got a very, he got to see what America was, and his what do you call it? His discernment is just absolutely fascinating to read. I mean, one can make a case for him as being a noble pagan, essentially. But yeah, so it's even like the Mao veneration is still a thing. The question is, how much longer will that still be a thing? Because Xi Jinping is literally doing everything he can to de-Maoify China.
Well, now to the point of the question that I posed, how much of a threat is China to the U.S.?
So to the American empire, it's a massive threat. To the American banking system, it's a massive threat because China's gotten out from underneath that system.
Right.
And what do you call it? So it's in that sense, they're a threat to America's ability to rule the world.
And they hold the most amount of debt, U.S. debt.
Correct. Yep. But they are dumping that in exchange for gold at the moment. And they're also stacking, interestingly enough, they're directly stacking U.S. dollars. Because I think they expected debt bubble, debt deflation to happen in the U.S., which they'd be correct about. What do you call it? But yeah, in terms of are they a threat to the American people? I'd say no. I mean, in my own history, again, my history is conquistador, not feather pen, but it's. What do you call it? We always had peace with China. My ancestors, it's even when they colonized the Philippines, the relationship was very cordial. The American people can have an excellent relationship with China. It's totally doable. It's just sad that the empire will not permit it to happen. The manufacturing power of China, the resources it has, the American, or not the American, but rather the international banking system, that the Federal Reserve is a part of, desperately needs to financialize China's economy to keep their, essentially debt game going.
Right. How much tied with that, because I've been, a lot of people have been speculating about the rise of India, right? So their population for the first time surpassed China. China's responded. I saw people talking about the one-child policy in China. If you aren't aware, it's now a three-child policy because they're aware of the demographic problems. So you can now have up to 3 children in China without being levied excess taxes for having more children. So they're trying to combat all that. They're clearly aware of it, and it's clearly a Han supremacist ideology. For those of you who don't know, there's actually quite a bit different ethnicities within China. But there's been this talk that India is going to be like the sort of future rival because of their population, many of them being able to speak English and all this different stuff. I'm kind of skeptical about India myself, even if they have the most amount of people in the world, just based on my own sentiments. And I would suspect that China would outcompete them. Obviously, there's been even military interactions over the Himalayas between the two nations. So, and then Russia's found a medium point in which they are, very strong trading partners now with China and India, which if you have the two largest countries in the world trading with, I mean, how much do you need the Western world. I mean, obviously it help, but you don't need them. So what are your guys' thoughts on India?
Frankly, I see India falling apart. It's in terms of like how often has India been united? Their version, like the Roman Empire of their history was the Maurya Empire, and that barely didn't even make it to 140 years.
Right.
And India has always been very, very divided. I mean, like the times they were united. I mean, you had the Mughal Empire, but that's when they were conquered by an outsider.
Muslims, yeah.
The united, British Raj they had the external British, empire that conquered them. The fundamental thing with India is, I mean,
and honestly, that was probably one of the more stable points.
Yeah, and on a spiritual basis, Neo-Confucianism has a lot of truth in it.
Yes.
How much truth in comparison does Hinduism have? And I'll quote, just so I don't get in too much trouble, I'll quote St. Paisios, where he was a time where he was flying over India, apparently, and he started praying intensely, and people asked why was he praying? So, why is he just suddenly started praying intensely? And he said, down there, it's not good. Like, it's just not good. So it's Hinduism.
It's a great point. It's a great point. And it's been, obviously with the H-1B visa talk and how many Indians take advantage of that system here in the United States, that there is yes, they do speak English, all the help centers in America, place them over in India. But there is like a major fundamental difference in worldviews. And, as you brought up Neo-Confucianism and Taoism, there's a lot of I've done streams covering those topics. There's a lot of philosophical, I mean, not maybe theological, but philosophical overlap with aspects of orthodoxy in regards to sort of especially Taoism and metaphysics of order and a concept of logos and that type of thing. Not exactly the same when you start getting into some of the Vedic traditions, which are Indo-European. And so India, it's an interesting history because, like, what do you consider the height of Indian history? And if you point to the Vedic period, those are Indo-Europeans. But anyways.
Mm-hmm. And it's, that's why it's like, I don't know. It really is the fundamental question. I mean, India has a subgroup of, a massive Muslim subpopulation.
Yep.
And then there's the issue of Indian women are just not reproducing. Like, even this is something you can observe in Texas.
Yeah. I read an article. Feminism is like exploding in India out of all the places in the world.
And if you look at people who immigrate to the United States, so despite all this massive Indian immigration, like it's approaching Mexican levels at this point in terms of rate. Indian women, the Hindu women specifically, don't reproduce. The Thomas Christians do reproduce, but specifically the Hindu ones, they don't. Like Georgetown is becoming very Indian. Like, given the unless the H-1B thing ceases, Georgetown will be majority Hindu in like the next 10, 15 years. But their women don't have children. Like, literally, it's like less than one child per woman. So it's not going to last. So it'll be Indian for like one generation, and then it won't be anymore. And depending on how things go, it could still be Georgetown. It might become San Jorge. Who knows? But it's crazy. Like, in the sense of just how that's the other thing too about Hinduism. It has no defense. Like, from liberalism. Like, Enlightenment liberalism just seems to like latch in and really.
It has no defense. There is no what we would consider in the West like a conservative strand within Hinduism. The best they have would be like a nationalist Hinduism, which is thriving in India. But Hinduism as an ideology is so pluralistic and accepts so many things that there is no single defining morality that you could unite behind.
There is no core. So like the Chinese Empire had, Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism and Taoism at its core. You had Shinto Buddhism and Mahayana as well at a certain point in Japanese history as their core.
Right.
The Russian Empire had Orthodoxy as its core. Spain had its flavor of Spanish Catholicism at its core. And, that's the thing, like, to have like a successful empire, which India is an empire. You need to have a fundamental uniting religious principle that the society organizes around, be it pagan or be it Orthodox.
But that nationalist movement, Modi, isn't he a Hindu nationalist? So it's like that they're trying to do that through Hinduism. But I agree with you. I don't see it as ultimately successful and unifying to the same degree that you'd find in some of the East Asian countries. But South Korea they're the lowest birth rate in the world. I mean, that's like the most urgent situation on the planet in regards to like literally annihilating themselves.
Yeah, it's Americanization is deadly. That's the root of it. I mean, you see it happening in Latin America, like in Colombia. You see the birth rates crashing. You see the single motherhood rates skyrocketing. And that's the thing you mentioned before, how the one-child policy is no more. It's a three-child policy. Like Xi was pretty explicit. He wants to eliminate restrictions on reproduction completely, and he even wants to ban abortion and no-fault divorce because he sees those as fundamentally not Chinese.
Right.
And that's actually my metric of when is it that Xi Jinping is actually the emperor. And my metric is when he's able to do what he wants without having to, bargain with the local oligarchic groups that exist in China or other oligarchic powers within the Politburo. That's when he's de facto emperor. And a good metric for that is when he'll do like goals that he himself has said he wants to do. So if there's a point where he succeeds and he actually gets rid of reproductive limits completely and eliminates no fault divorce, that's my metric for like, okay, he now has solid control as emperor of China. Like that's when he has the mandate of heaven.
Right. I did read that, China has the largest disparity between men and women because of that one-child policy, and then people put a preeminence on the male babies. So there's like a massive segment of the Chinese population they suspect will never have children, like the men. So I think to your point about Xi Jinping, for him, doing away with abortion also does away with all these mass abortions of young girls, which has actually been terrible for China. It didn't work out the way that they thought it was going to.
And the thing to keep into account is the one-child policy was not something native to China. It was the Rockefellers who came up with that, and Mao, being their man, implemented it.
Right.
The purpose of one-child policy was not to solve, China's internal demographic problems. The purpose of it was to keep China down so that it could be the essentially industrial slave colony of the Rockefellers.
Right.
In their quest for one world government.
Right. And that relationship, that's why, you see the Bidens and the $100 million payment to Hunter, like what you're, at least in my opinion, maybe you have a different view on this, but that Rockefeller tentacle, that Western oligarchic central banking tentacle that operates within China proper, maybe it doesn't have the same sway because Xi Jinping certainly is trying to move things in a different direction. But you can see that's why that alliance between these Western nations and, they're okay with selling out manufacturing to China because this is all part of a larger deal.
Mm-hmm. That was the purpose. And, Xi Jinping coming to power and, knocking out Jiang Zemin, who was in bed with the Western oligarchs. That was not part of the plan. The thing was, so the Politburo internally was divided. So you had Hu Jintao, who was the previous guy, and the three big factions. So we had the Maoist guy that we mentioned, Bo Jialei. He led the Maoists. You had the Shanghai clique and the Trotskyites, which were united underneath Jiang Zemin. You had the Young Communist Leaders faction that was underneath the other guy whose name I don't remember. Those were like the big players, and then you had minor players within the Politburo, and they couldn't come to an agreement over who was going to be the nominal figurehead because in reality, Jiang Zemin was the guy with the power, but the other factions were growing stronger, and they couldn't agree on terms of who they would let be the next secretary. So they decided they would pick a nobody, and at the time, Xi Jinping was a nobody. He was a low-level member of the. So he was there in the Politburo, but he was like one of the lowest rank, and he never the only time he ever spoke, he would literally read stuff off an index card and then sit down. Every single faction thought he was just essentially a harmless midwit who could be easily manipulated, and they agreed together to put him in power or make him secretary. And that's how he became secretary of the party, and came in power. And then what he immediately started doing was he started befriending the colonels and the officer corps who actually lead the troops of the red aristocracy. So the Chinese government system is fascinating. So it is a one-party state, but the different factions, they had an agreement between those who run the People's Army and the Politburo, where essentially the families which control the Politburo agree to never study anything related to how to run a military or war. And the families that control the People's Army, they agreed to never have any of their children or grandchildren study how to run a state. So that way the two sides would need each other and not have a civil war, which is a fascinating, study of internal oligarchic politics. But Xi, who was trained in, how to run a state, befriended essentially all the non-political or the non-politician roles. So essentially everyone below general. And that's how he started building a power base to knock out these various groups one by one, knocking out Beaujolais, knocking out Jiang Zemin, winning over a portion of the Shanghai clique over to his side, and then, breaking the rest, breaking the Young Communist Leaders faction guy, and essentially reconfucianizing China as being his goal. And that's when in the West, if you remember news media from 15 years ago, they're always praising China because it was the Western bankers guy who was in power in China. Once Xi Jinping knocked Jiang Zemin out, that was when things flipped, and suddenly every news organization that was praising China before, like CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, Washington Post, all of them suddenly flip and they become anti-China. It's because their guy got knocked out, and that's why I do see an element of divine providence in there, because that was not supposed to happen. And I see it as God's mercy that which was not supposed to happen happened. And another reason I believe there's a divine hand of providence in it too is because it was Xi Jinping who legalized orthodoxy in China, and the Chinese Orthodox Church has been able to come out of the catacombs, literally. And 2019 they permitted Chinese to be ordained as clergy again. And in 2020,
isn't it? And I could be wrong, but I believe that Rokor is the only official Orthodox church in China.
The Chinese church, they ran underneath the mantle of the Moscow Patriarchate and Rokor. Yeah,
that's what I thought.
So there in 2022 is I think when the first, or was it 2023? Anyway, recently, just a few years ago, the first Chinese clerics were actually tonsured and ordained. So it's my test in terms of the thing I'm hoping for is that the Orthodox community in Hubei, that they get their cathedral back, because Mao Zedong was destroying all the churches, etc.
Right.
As foreign influence when he himself was a foreign influence, but he wanted to concentrate all power in his hands, and he wanted to destroy all religion. The Hagia Sophia in Hubei, which it's the same. It's named after the same, like the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Right. That's the biggest cathedral in the Far East. It is huge, and it's there in Hubei, China. And Mao ordered it to be destroyed. And for some reason, the general he gave the orders to decided to not preserve it because it was pretty, and he didn't, but Mao was never informed that it was never destroyed. The People's Army then proceeded to use it to store weapons-grade explosives. And miraculously, they had no accidents for decades, so it didn't blow up. And it currently stands, and it's currently a museum piece. But the parish that built it still exists in Hubei. They currently meet in their smaller, much smaller, chapel in their cemetery, the Orthodox cemetery there. I've been praying that, that for me is the metric over whether or not Xi Jinping could potentially be, the Constantinople of the Far East. Will he return, the cathedral back to the church? That's interesting. So we'll see.
Well, gentlemen, is there any final comments before we wrap up this open panel? I think we've hit most of the topics that I wrote down to address tonight. One I was going to say for a future open panel was the threat of transhumanism and technocracy, because that obviously plays in with Stargate Project, Vance, Teal, PayPal Mafia, Elon Musk, all that good stuff. But that's almost a whole nother topic. So I was going to save that for another open panel in the future. But regarding the Trump administration, maybe a good way to conclude is like, what would you give if you had to grade them for the first 3 months? What kind of grades would you give?
7. A 7 out of 10.
Give me an A through F, but 7.
A through F. C plus, B minus.
B, C plus. Okay.
If I'm grading on a curve where A is Andrew Jackson, then he is a B.
Okay. I was going to say for myself, probably a C plus, B minus was what I was going to say. So, all right, let me double check, make sure we hit all the super chats. Don't want anybody to be left out. Jose, always good to see you, man. It's great to see that you're doing better. God bless you and the family.
Thank you.
And Ivan, always a pleasure to see you, my man. Things going well with you? Everything good in Spain?
Yeah. I'm working as an English teacher, so I'm making a decent living with a lot of free time. I get to be around kids, which are always a joy. So I'm doing good. I'm battling, let's say, a few modernist, surgeonist priests that I have in my parish, but that's something for another time. I'm doing well with my spiritual life. All good, man.
Sounds great, man. Well, it's good to see you. God bless you and the family as well. And looks like Alex said a C+. Yeah, that's about right. I'd say B-, but yeah, that's about right. And Eric was asking for your guys' Twitter handles or X handles if you have any. So feel free to drop those in the chat if you guys have them for the future. But just want to thank you guys for coming on. Always appreciate your guys' insights. And now that I'm done with my dissertation, you'll be seeing tons of streams in the next couple weeks, at least every other day. So excited to be back. God bless everyone. Blessed Lent to everyone as well. Hope you guys are staying strong. And April 20th is the day. So we got 17 more days before Christ rises. So anyways, God bless everyone. And I will see you all in the next one. And major thank you to everybody who supported. So as always, until then, God bless.